Welcome. You've come to discover how Rome survived its darkest hour, designed to gently guide you into profound, peaceful sleep. You'll be immersed in the harrowing and triumphant events that tested the early Roman Republic, narrated to bring you ultimate relaxation. Let's begin now with Book 5 of Titus Livius, Now That the City is Free. Imagine the shock of a rising power brought to its knees by a foreign invasion, its very existence hanging by a thread. How did Rome, after the devastating sack by the Gauls, not only recover but emerge stronger and more determined than ever? And can the echoes of this ancient resilience now bring stillness to your modern mind? This isn't just history. It's a testament to unwavering spirit, perfectly presented to help you unwind and achieve deep sleep. Prepare to discover how Rome's ultimate test can surprisingly be your new favorite path to rest. If you find this journey peaceful, please like this video, share your thoughts on Roman resilience in the comments below, and subscribe for more calming historical explorations. The History of Rome, Book 5. Chapter 1. Roman Veientian Conflict. Peace had been established everywhere else, but the Romans and Veientians remained locked in a bitter struggle. Their animosity was so great that it was clear ruin awaited the vanquished party. The two states approached their elections very differently. The Romans increased the number of military tribunes with consular power, appointing 8, more than ever before. These included Manius Aemilius Mamercinus for a second time, Lucius Valerius Potitus for a third, Appius Claudius Crassus, Marcus Quintilius Varus, Lucius Julius Iulus, Marcus Postumius, Marcus Furius Camillus, and Marcus Postumius Albinus. The Veientians, however, tired of the annual political maneuvering that often caused division, elected a king instead. This decision offended the other states of Etruria, not only because they disliked kings, but also because they disliked this particular king. He had already made himself unpopular due to his wealth and arrogance. He had violently interrupted some annual games, an omission considered impious, simply because he was angry about being passed over for a priesthood. Another man had been preferred by the votes of the 12 states, and in a fit of pique, the king had abruptly removed the performers, many of whom were his own slaves, in the middle of the ceremony. Consequently, the Etruscan nation, known for its devotion to religious observances and its excellence in conducting them, decreed that aid would be refused to the Veientians as long as they were subject to a king. However, this decree was suppressed in Veii out of fear of the king, who would have seen anyone who mentioned it as a leader of sedition, not merely the bearer of a rumor. Though reports reaching Rome indicated a temporary calm in Etruria, the Romans were aware that the Etruscan decree was being debated in all their assemblies. They therefore fortified their position strategically to ensure security on both sides. Some defenses faced Veii to guard against sorties, while others looked toward Etruria to deter any potential auxiliaries. When the Roman generals realized a blockade offered more hope than an assault, they began constructing winter huts, a novel concept for Roman soldiers. Their determination was to continue the war by wintering there. News of this reached Rome, igniting the tribunes of the people, who had long lacked a pretext for agitation. They rushed to the assembly, stirring the emotions of the common citizens. They declared that this was the real reason for the soldiers' new pay, and that they had suspected such a gift from the enemy was tainted with poison. They claimed the liberty of the commons had been sold, and that their youth, removed forever and exiled from the city and the republic, were now forced to endure winter's hardships without returning home or attending to their private affairs. What, they asked, could be the reason for this unending service? Undoubtedly, it was to prevent anything being done for their own interests by the presence of these young men, who represent the entire strength of the commons. They argued that the Roman soldiers were harassed and worked much more severely than the Veientians. The Veientians spent the winter beneath their own roofs, defending their city with strong walls and natural defenses, while the Roman soldier continued beneath the covering of skins, overwhelmed with snow and frost, never laying aside his arms, even during winter, a time of respite from all wars by land and sea. They asserted that neither kings, nor those tyrannical consuls before the tribunician office, nor the stern authority of the dictator, nor the overbearing decemvirs, ever imposed such slavery as unremitting military service. They accused the military tribunes of now exercising this degree of regal power over the Roman commons. What, they exclaimed, would these men have done as consuls or dictators who have exhibited such an implacable and menacing proconsular office? But all this happens justly. Among 8 military tribunes, there is no room even for one plebeian. Formerly, the patricians filled 3 places with the utmost difficulty. Now they march 8 deep to take possession of various offices. Not even in such a crowd is any plebeian included, who, if he did no other good, might remind his colleagues that the army consisted of freemen and fellow citizens, not slaves. These men ought to be brought back during winter, at least, to their homes and roofs, to see their parents, children, and wives at some point in the year, to exercise the rights of freedom, and to take part in electing magistrates. As they made these and similar declarations, they found an equally formidable opponent in Appius Claudius. He had been left behind by his colleagues specifically to counter the tribune's turbulence. Claudius was a man who, even from his youth, had been trained in contests with the plebeians. Years before, as mentioned, he had advocated dissolving the tribunician power through the protests of their colleagues. Claudius, endowed with natural ability and refined by experience, delivered the following address. Romans, if there was ever reason to doubt whether the tribunes of the people have ever incited sedition for your sake or their own, I am certain that this year that doubt must have vanished. I rejoice that an end has come to such a long-standing mistake, and I congratulate you, and through you the Republic, that this delusion has been dispelled during a time of prosperity. Can anyone truly doubt that the tribunes of the commons were never so displeased and provoked by any wrongs done to you, if such ever occurred, as by the generosity of the patricians to the commons, when pay was established for those serving in the army? What else do you suppose they feared then, or wished to disrupt now, except the unity between the orders, which they believe contributes most to the dissolution of the tribunician power? Thus, by Jove, like workers of iniquity, they seek out work, always wanting some diseased part in the Republic, so they can be employed by you to cure it. For tribunes, do you defend or attack the commons? Are you the enemies of those in service, or do you plead their cause? Unless perhaps you say, whatever the patricians do displeases us, whether it is for the commons or against them. Just as masters forbid their slaves from dealing with others, and deem it right that they should refrain from all commerce, whether for kindness or unkindness, so too do you interdict us, the patricians, from all intercourse with the people. You fear that by our courtesy and generosity we might win their regard, and they become tractable and obedient to our direction. If you possessed any feeling, I say not of fellow citizens, but of human beings, how much more ought you to favor and, as far as you lay, promote the kindly demeanor of the patricians and the tractability of the commons. If such concord were once permanent, who would not venture to claim that this empire would soon become supreme among neighboring states? I shall hereafter explain how not only expedient, but even necessary, has been this plan of my colleagues to not withdraw the army from Veii until the business is completed. For the present, I wish to speak about the condition of the soldiers. My observations, I believe, would seem reasonable not only to you, but even to the soldiers themselves if delivered in the camp. On this subject, if nothing came to my own mind to say, I would certainly be satisfied with what is suggested by the arguments of my adversaries. They lately said that pay should not be given to soldiers because it had never been given. How then can they now be displeased that additional labor should be imposed proportionally on those to whom additional profit has been given? In no case is there labor without emolument, nor emolument generally without the expense of labor. Toil and pleasure, though most unlike in nature, are linked by a kind of natural connection. Formerly, the soldier found it a hardship to give his labor to the commonwealth at his own expense. Yet he was glad to till his own ground for part of the year, to acquire the means to support himself and his family at home and in war. Now he feels pleasure that the Republic benefits him, and he gladly receives his pay. Let him therefore bear with patience being absent a little longer from home and his family affairs, to which no heavy expense is now attached. If the Commonwealth were to call him to account, would it not justly say, "You have pay by the year, perform labor by the year"? Do you think it is just to receive a whole year's pay for 6 months' service? Romans, I reluctantly dwell on this topic, for that is how those who employ mercenary troops should proceed. But we wish to treat you as fellow citizens, and we think it only just that you treat us as you would your country. Either the war should not have been undertaken, or it ought to be conducted suitably to the dignity of the Roman people, and brought to a close as soon as possible. But it will be concluded if we press on the besieged, if we do not retire until we have fulfilled our hopes by the capture of Veii. Indeed, if there were no other motive, the very discredit of the thing should compel our perseverance. In former times, all Greece besieged a city for 10 years for the sake of one woman. How far from their homes? How many lands, how many seas away? We grumble at enduring a siege of a year's duration within 20 miles of us, almost within sight of our own city. Is it because, I suppose, the cause of the war is trifling, or because there is insufficient just resentment to stimulate our perseverance? 7 times they have rebelled. In peace, they never acted faithfully. They have laid waste to our lands 1,000 times. They forced the Fighting nations to revolt against us. They put our colonists there to death. Contrary to the law of nations, they instigated the impious murder of our ambassadors. They wished to incite all Etruria against us, and are busy at it this very day, and they scarcely refrained from violating our ambassadors when demanding restitution. With such people, ought war to be conducted in a remiss and dilatory manner? If such just resentment has no influence on us, will not, I entreat you, the following considerations influence you? Their city has been enclosed with immense works, by which the enemy is confined within their walls. They have not tilled their land, and what was previously tilled has been laid waste in the war. If we withdraw our army, who can doubt that they will invade our territory, not only from a desire of revenge, but also from the necessity of plundering from the property of others, since they have lost their own? By such measures, then, we do not put off the war but admit it within our own frontiers. What shall I say of what truly interests the soldiers, for whose interests these worthy tribunes of the commons are now suddenly so anxious to provide, after having tried to take their pay from them? How does it stand? They have formed a rampart and a trench, both works of great labor, over such a vast extent of ground. They erected forts, a few at first, then many more as the army grew. They have raised defenses not only toward the city, but also toward Etruria, against any succors that might come from there. What need I mention towers, Veii, and testudines, and the other apparatus used in attacking towns? When so much labor has been expended, and they have now at last reached the end of the work, do you think all these preparations should be abandoned so that next summer the same course of toil may have to be undergone again in forming them anew? How much less trouble to maintain the works already done, to press on and persevere, and to get rid of our task. For certainly, the matter is of short duration if conducted with a uniform course of exertions, and we do not expedite the attainment of our hopes by these intermissions and interruptions. I am now speaking of labor and loss of time. What? Do these frequent meetings in Etruria, concerning sending aid to Veii, allow us to disregard the danger we face by procrastinating the war? As matters stand now, they are incensed, they dislike them, they refuse to send any. As far as they are concerned, we are at liberty to take Veii. Who can promise that their temper will be the same hereafter if the war is suspended? If you allow any relaxation, more respectable and frequent embassies will go. What now displeases the Etrurians, the establishment of a king at Veii, may, after an interval, be done away with, either by the joint determination of the state to regain the goodwill of the Etrurians, or by a voluntary act of the king, unwilling for his reign to hinder the welfare of his countrymen. See how many detrimental circumstances follow that line of conduct. The loss of works formed with such great labor, the threatening devastation of our frontiers, an Etruscan war instead of a Veientian one. These tribunes are your measures, much the same, in truth, as if a person should render a disease tedious, and perhaps incurable, for the sake of present meat or drink, in a patient who, by resolutely allowing himself to be treated, might soon recover his health. If, by Jove, it were of no consequence for the current war, it would certainly be of the utmost importance to military discipline. Our soldiers should be accustomed not only to enjoy victory, but also, if matters proceed more slowly than anticipated, to endure the tediousness and await the outcome of their hopes, however delayed. If the war isn't finished in the summer, they should wait for winter, and not, like summer birds, seek shelter and retreat at the very beginning of autumn. I ask you, the eagerness and pleasure of hunting drives men into snow and frost, over mountains and through woods. Shall we not employ that same patience for the exigencies of war, which even sport and pleasure can elicit? Are we to suppose that our soldiers' bodies are so effeminate, their minds so feeble, that they cannot endure one winter in a camp and be absent from home? That, like those who wage a naval war, by taking advantage of the weather and observing the season, they can endure neither heat nor cold? They would surely blush if anyone accused them of these things. They would maintain that both their minds and bodies possessed manly endurance, and that they were capable of conducting war equally well in winter and in summer. They would declare that they had not entrusted the tribunes with the patronage of indolence and sloth, and that they remembered their ancestors created this very power neither in the shade nor beneath their roofs. Such sentiments are worthy of the valor of your soldiers, worthy of the Roman name. We must not consider merely Veii, nor this immediate war, but seek a reputation for future wars and other states. Do you consider the difference of opinion likely to result from this matter as trivial? Which I ask our neighboring states to believe, that the Roman people are such that if anyone can sustain their first, very brief assault, they have nothing more to fear? Or should the terror of our name be such that neither the tediousness of a distant siege, nor the inclemency of winter can dislodge a Roman army from a city once invested? That they know no other termination of war than victory, and that they conduct wars with perseverance as much as with briskness, which is necessary in every kind of war, but especially in besieging cities. Most of these, impregnable both by their works and by natural situation, time itself overpowers and reduces by famine and thirst. This will reduce Veii, unless the tribunes of the commons provide aid to the enemy, and the Veientians find reinforcements in Rome, which they seek in vain in Etruria. Is there anything that could happen more in accordance with the wishes of the Veientians than for the Roman city, and then the camp, to be filled with sedition, as if by contagion? But, by Jove, among the enemy, such a forbearing state of mind prevails that not a single change has occurred among them, neither from disgust at the length of the siege, nor even at the kingly form of government. Nor has the refusal of aid by the Etrurians aroused their tempers. For whoever incites sedition will be instantly put to death, and no one will be permitted to utter those sentiments that among you are expressed with impunity. He is sure to receive the bastinade who forsakes his colors or quits his post. Yet persons advising not one or two soldiers, but whole armies, to relinquish their colors or to forsake their camp, are openly listened to in your public assemblies. Accordingly, whatever a tribune of the people says, even if it tends to the ruin of the country or the dissolution of the commonwealth, you are accustomed to listen to with partiality. Captivated by the charms of that authority, you allow all sorts of crimes to lie concealed beneath it. The only thing that remains is what they shout here. These same projects they then realize in the camp and among the soldiers, seducing the armies and not allowing them to obey their officers. Since that, and that only, is liberty in Rome, to show no deference to the Senate, nor to magistrates, nor laws, nor the usages of ancestors, nor the institutions of our fathers, nor military discipline. Even then, Appius was a match for the tribunes of the people in the popular assemblies. Then, suddenly, a misfortune suffered before Veii, from an unexpected quarter, gave Appius the superiority in the dispute. It also produced greater harmony between the different orders and increased ardor to carry on the siege of Veii with more tenacity. For when the trenches were now advanced to the very city, and the machines were almost about to be applied to the walls, the works were carried on with greater assiduity by day than they were guarded by night. A gate was suddenly thrown open, and a vast multitude, armed chiefly with torches, cast fire about on all sides. After an hour, the flames destroyed both the rampart and the machines, the work of so long a time. Many men, bringing assistance in vain, were destroyed by the sword and by fire. When the account of this circumstance reached Rome, it inspired sadness into all ranks. The Senate felt anxiety and apprehension, fearing that the sedition could no longer be withstood either in the city or in the camp, and that the tribunes of the commons would insult the commonwealth as if vanquished by them. Then, suddenly, those who possessed equestrian wealth, but to whom horses had not been assigned by the public, having previously held a meeting together, went to the Senate. Having obtained permission to speak, they promised they would serve on their own horses. When thanks were returned to them by the Senate in the most complimentary terms, and the report of this proceeding spread through the forum and the city, a concourse of the common people suddenly gathered at the Senate House. They declared that they were now of the pedestrian order, and they offered their services to the Commonwealth, though not compelled to serve, whether they wished to march them to Veii or to any other place. If they were led to Veii, they affirmed that they would not return from there until the enemy's city was taken. Then indeed they with difficulty contained their joy, which now poured in upon them. They were not ordered, as in the case of the horsemen, to be publicly eulogized, the order for so doing being consigned to the magistrates, nor were they summoned into the Senate House to receive an answer. Nor did the Senate confine themselves within the threshold of their house, but every one of them individually, with their voice and hands, testified from the elevated ground the public joy to the multitude standing in the assembly. They declared that by that unanimity the Roman city would be happy, invincible, and eternal. They praised the horsemen, praised the common citizens, extolled the day itself by their praises, and acknowledged that the courtesy and kindness of the Senate was outdone. Tears flowed in abundance through joy, both from the patricians and the common citizens, until the senators, being called back into the House, passed a decree of the Senate, that the military tribunes, summoning an assembly, should return thanks to the infantry and cavalry, and should state that the Senate would be mindful of their affectionate attachment to their country. But it was their wish that their pay should continue for those who had, out of their turn, undertaken voluntary service. To the horsemen also a certain stipend was assigned. Then for the first time, the cavalry began to serve on their own horses. This army of volunteers, being led to Veii, not only restored the works which had been lost, but also erected new ones. Supplies were conveyed from the city with greater care than before, lest anything should be wanted for the accommodation of an army who deserved so well. The following year, Caius Servilius Ahala for a third time, Quintus Servilius, Lucius Virginius, Quintus Sulpicius, Aulus Manlius for a second time, and Manius Sergius for a second time, served as military tribunes with consular authority. During their tribuneship, while everyone's attention was on the Veientian War, the garrison at Anxur was neglected. Due to soldiers being absent on leave and the indiscriminate admission of Volscian traders, the guards at the gates were suddenly betrayed, and the garrison was overpowered. Fewer soldiers perished because they were all trafficking through the countryside and city like sutlers. Nor were matters more successful at Veii, which was then the chief object of all public solicitude. For the Roman commanders had more quarrels among themselves than spirit against the enemy, and the severity of the war was exaggerated by the sudden arrival of the Capanations and the Philicians. These two states of Etruria, being contiguous, judged that if Veii was conquered, they would be next to face Roman attacks. The Philicians also, incensed by a personal cause, having already previously involved themselves in a Fidenatian war, were bound together by an oath through reciprocal embassies, and marched unexpectedly with their armies to Veii. It so happened that they attacked the camp in the sector commanded by Manius Sergius, the military tribune, causing great alarm because the Romans imagined that all Etruria had been aroused and was advancing in a great mass. The same opinion aroused the Veientians in the city. Thus the Roman camp was attacked on both sides. Crowding together, as they wheeled their battalions from one post to another, They were unable either to confine the Veientians within their fortifications or repel the assault from their own works and defend themselves from the enemy outside. The only hope was if succor could be brought from the larger camp, so that different legions could fight, some against the Capenations and Felicians, others against the sallies of the townsmen. But Virginius had command of that camp, and he was personally hateful to and incensed against Sergius. When word was brought that most of the forts were attacked, the fortifications scaled, and that the enemy were pouring in on both sides, he kept his men under arms, saying that if there was need of assistance, his colleague would send them to him. His arrogance was equaled by the obstinacy of the other, who, so he might not appear to have sought any aid from an adversary, preferred being defeated by an enemy to conquering through a fellow citizen. His men were for a long time cut down between both. At length, abandoning their works, a very small number made their way to the principal camp. The greater number, with Sergius himself, made their way to Rome. There, when Sergius threw the entire blame on his colleague, it was resolved that Virginius should be sent from the camp, and that lieutenant generals should take command in the meantime. The affair was then discussed in the Senate, and the dispute was carried on between the colleagues with mutual recriminations. Few, however, took up the interests of the Republic. The greater number favored one or the other, according to private regard or interest. The principal senators were of the opinion that whether such an ignominious defeat had been sustained through the misconduct or misfortune of the commanders, the regular time of the elections should not be waited for, but that new military tribunes should be created immediately, who should enter into office on the calends of October. While they were proceeding to intimate their assent to this opinion, the other military tribunes offered no opposition. But Sergius and Virginius, on whose account it was evident that the Senate were dissatisfied with the magistrates of that year, at first deprecated the ignominy, then protested against the decree of the Senate. They declared that they would not retire from office before the Ides of December, the usual day for persons entering on magisterial duties. Upon this, the tribunes of the plebeians, who had unwillingly kept silent during the general harmony and prosperous state of public affairs, suddenly becoming confident, began to threaten the military tribunes. They stated that unless they conformed to the order of the Senate, they would order them to be thrown into prison. Then Caius Servilius Ahala, a military tribune, observed, "With respect to you, tribunes of the commons, and your threats, I would with pleasure put it to the test how there is not more authority in the latter than spirit in yourselves. But it is impious to strive against the authority of the Senate. Therefore, cease to seek amid our quarrels for an opportunity of doing mischief. And my colleagues will either do what the Senate thinks fit, or if they shall persist with too much pertinacity, I will immediately nominate a dictator, who will oblige them to retire from office." When this speech was approved with general consent, and the patricians rejoiced that without the terrors of the tribunician office, another and a superior power had been discovered to coerce the magistrates, overcome by the universal consent, they held the elections of military tribunes, who were to commence their office on the calends of October, and before that day they retired from office. During the military tribuneship of Lucius Valerius Potitus for the 4th time, Marcus Furius Camillus for the 2nd time, Manius Aemilius Mamercinus for a 3rd time, Gnaeus Cornelius Cassus for a 2nd time, Ciso Fabius Ambustus, and Lucius Julius Iulus, much business transpired at home and abroad. A complex war was waged simultaneously at Veii, Capena, and Falerii, and against the Volscians to recover Anxur. At the same time, difficulties arose from the levy and the collection of taxes. There was also contention over the appointment of plebeian tribunes, and 2 trials of former consular officials caused considerable commotion. First, the tribunes of the soldiers ensured the levy was held. Not only were juniors enlisted, but seniors were also compelled to serve as a garrison for the city. As the number of soldiers increased, so did the need for pay, which was collected through a tax. Those remaining at home contributed unwillingly, as those guarding the city also had to perform military service for the Commonwealth. The tribunes of the commons, through their seditious speeches, made these already burdensome matters seem more exasperating. They asserted that pay was established for soldiers with the aim of exhausting one half of the commons through military service and the other half through taxes. They claimed a single war was being prolonged for a third year on purpose, so they might have a longer time to wage it. They protested that armies had been raised in one levy for 4 different wars, and that even boys and old men were dragged from home. They lamented that neither summer nor winter now made any difference, so there would never be any respite for the unfortunate commons, who were now even made to pay a tax. After they returned home, their bodies wasted by hardship, wounds, and eventually by age, finding their properties neglected due to the owner's absence, they had to pay a tax out of their impaired fortunes and refund to the state, in a manifold proportion, the military pay which had been, as it were, received on interest. Between the levy and the tax, and with their minds occupied by more important concerns, the number of plebeian tribunes could not be filled at the elections. An attempt was then made to elect patricians into the vacant places. When this failed, it was still managed, for the purpose of weakening the Tribonian law, that Caius Licerius and Marcus Acucius, no doubt through the influence of the patricians, should be admitted as tribunes of the commons. Chance so directed it that this year Gnaeus Trebonius was tribune of the commons. He considered it his duty, as a debt to his name and family, to champion the Tribonian law. He cried aloud that a point which some patricians had aimed at, though baffled in their first attempt, had yet been carried by the military tribunes. The Tribonian law had been subverted, and tribunes of the commons had been elected not by the suffrages of the people, but by the mandate of the patricians. The situation had now come to this: either patricians or their dependents were to be tribunes of the commons. The devoting laws were taken away, the tribunician power wrested from them. He alleged this was effected by some artifice of the patricians, by the villainy and treachery of his colleagues. While not only the patricians, but also the tribunes of the commons became objects of public resentment, both those who were elected and those who had elected them, then 3 of the college, Publius Curiatius, Marcus Metilius, and Marcus Minucius, alarmed for their own interests, launched an attack on Sergius and Virginius, military tribunes of the previous year. They shifted the resentment of the commons and public odium from themselves onto these 2 by appointing a day for their trial. They observed that those persons by whom the levy, the tribute, the long service, and the distant seat of the war was felt as a grievance, those who lamented the calamity sustained at Veii, such as had their houses in mourning through the loss of children, brothers, relatives, and kinsmen, now through their means had the right and power of avenging the public and private sorrow on the 2 guilty causes. They asserted that the sources of all their sufferings were centered in Sergius and Virginius. Nor did the prosecutor advance that charge more satisfactorily than the accused acknowledged it, who, both guilty, threw the blame from one to the other, Virginius charging Sergius with running away, Sergius charging Virginius with treachery. The folly of whose conduct was so incredible that it is much more probable that the affair had been contrived by concert and by the common artifice of the patricians. They continued, by them also an opportunity was formerly given to the Veientians to burn the works for the sake of protracting the war. And now the army was betrayed, and the Roman camp delivered up to the Philicians. Everything was done so that the young men should grow old before Veii, and that the tribunes should not be able to consult the people either regarding the lands or the other interests of the commons, and to give weight to their measures by a numerous attendance of citizens, and to make head against the conspiracy of the patricians. They argued that a previous judgment had been already passed on the accused both by the Senate and the Roman people and by their own colleagues. For by a decree of the Senate they had been removed from the administration of affairs, and when they refused to resign their office they had been forced into it by their colleagues, and the Roman people had elected tribunes, who were to enter on their office not on the Ides of December, the usual day, but instantly on the calends of October, because the Republic could no longer subsist, these persons remaining in office. And yet, they exclaimed, these individuals, overwhelmed and already condemned by so many decisions against them, presented themselves for trial before the people. They thought that they were done with the matter, and had suffered sufficient punishment, because they were reduced to the state of private citizens 2 months sooner than ordinary. They did not consider that the power of doing mischief any longer was then taken from them, that punishment was not inflicted, for the official power of their colleagues also had been taken from them, who certainly had committed no fault. They urged the Roman citizens should resume those sentiments which they had when the recent disaster was sustained, when they beheld the army flying in consternation, covered with wounds, and in dismay pouring into the gates, accusing not fortune nor any of the gods, but these their commanders. They were certain that there was not a man present in the assembly who did not execute and detest the persons, families, and fortunes of Lucius Virginius and Manius Sergius. It was by no means consistent that now, when it was lawful and their duty, they should not exert their power against persons on whom they had severally imprecated the vengeance of the gods. The gods themselves never laid hands on the guilty. It was enough if they armed the injured with the means of taking revenge. Urged on by these discourses, the commons condemned the accused to a fine of 10,000 asses in weight. Sergius vainly blamed fortune and the common chance of war, while Virginius pleaded that he might not be more unfortunate at home than he had been in the field. The resentment of the people, being turned against them, obliterated the memory of the tribune's assumption of power and the fraud committed against the Tribonian law. The victorious tribunes, so that the people might reap an immediate benefit from the trial, published a form of an agrarian law and prevented the tax from being contributed. This created a need to pay for such a great number of troops, and the military enterprises were conducted successfully in such a manner that in none of the wars did they reach the consummation of their hope. At Veii, the lost camp was recovered and strengthened with forts and a garrison. Here Emilius and Caeso Fabius, military tribunes, commanded. None of the enemies were found outside the walls by Marcus Furius in the Faliscan territory and Gnaeus Cornelius in the Capenatian district. Spoil was driven off, and the country laid waste by burning houses and crops. The towns were neither assaulted nor besieged. But among the Volscians, their territory being depopulated, Anxur, which was situated on an eminence, was assaulted, but to no purpose. When force was ineffectual, they began to surround it with a rampart and a trench. The province of the Volscians had fallen to Valerius Potitus. In this state of military affairs, an internal disturbance broke out with greater violence than the wars proceeded with. When the tribunes made it impossible to collect the tax, and the payment to the generals was not remitted, the soldiers became impatient for their pay. The camp, too, was well nigh being involved in the contagion of the sedition in the city. Amid this resentment of the commons against the patricians, though the tribunes asserted that now was the time for establishing liberty and transferring the sovereign dignity from the Sergi and Virginii to plebeians, men of fortitude and energy, still they proceeded no further than the election of one of the commons, Publius Licinius Calvus, as military tribune with consular power, for the purpose of establishing their right by precedent. The others elected were patricians, Publius Manius, Lucius Titinius, Publius Maelius, Lucius Furius Metellinus, Lucius Publius Volscus. The commons themselves were surprised at having gained so important a point, and not merely he who had been elected, being a person who had filled no post of honor before, being only a senator of long standing, and now weighed down with years. Nor does it sufficiently appear why he was elected first, and in preference to anyone else, to taste the sweets of the new dignity. Some think that he was raised to such a high dignity through the influence of his brother, Gnaeus Cornelius, who had been military tribune in the preceding year and had given triple pay to the cavalry. Others say that he himself had delivered a seasonable address, equally acceptable to the patricians and commons, concerning the harmony of the several orders of the state. The tribunes of the commons, exulting in this victory at the election, relaxed in their opposition regarding the tax, a matter which greatly impeded the progress of public business. It was paid in with submission and sent to the army. In the country of the Volscians, Anxur was soon retaken, its guarding having been neglected during a festival day. This year was remarkable for a cold and snowy winter, so that the roads were impassable and the Tiber not navigable. The price of provisions remained unchanged due to the abundance previously stored. Because Publius Licinius obtained his office without any rioting, to the greater joy of the commons than annoyance of the patricians, and also administered it well, a rapturous desire to elect plebeians at the next election took possession of them. Of the patricians, Marcus Veturius alone obtained a place. Almost all the centuries appointed the other plebeian candidates as military tribunes with consular authority. Marcus Pomponius, Caius Duilius, Valero Publilius, Gnaeus Genutius, Lucius Attilius. The severe winter, whether from the ill temperature of the air arising from the abrupt transition to the contrary state, or from whatever other cause, was followed by an unhealthy summer, destructive to all species of animals. When neither the cause nor termination of this intractable pestilence could be discovered, the Sibylline books were consulted according to a decree of the Senate. The duumvirs for the direction of religious matters then, for the first time, introduced the lectisternium into the city of Rome. For 8 days, they implored the favor of Apollo and Latona, Diana and Hercules, Mercury and Neptune, with 3 couches laid out with the greatest magnificence then possible. The same solemn rite was observed also by private individuals, with doors lying open throughout the entire city, and everything laid out in common. It is said that all passers-by, both known and unknown indiscriminately, were invited to lodgings, and that conversation was adopted between persons at variance with complaisance and kindness, and that they refrained from disputes and quarrels. Their chains were also taken off those who were in confinement during those days. It was later felt a scruple to imprison those to whom the gods had brought such aid. In the meantime, the alarm multiplied at Veii, with 3 wars converging in one place. For as the Capanations and Philicians had suddenly come with succor to the Veientians, they had to fight against 3 armies on different sides, in the same manner as formerly, through the whole extent of their works. The recollection of the sentence passed on Sergius and Virginius aided them above everything else. Accordingly, some forces being led around in a short time from the principal camp, where some delay had been made on the former occasion, attacked the Capanations on their rear, while they were engaged in front against the Roman rampart. The fight commencing in this quarter struck terror into the Philicians also, and a sally from the camp, opportunely made, put them to flight, thrown into disorder as they now were. The victors, having then pursued them in their retreat, made great slaughter among them. Soon after, those who had been devastating the territory of Capena, having met them as if by chance, entirely cut off the survivors of the fight as they were straggling through the country. Many of the Veientians, in their retreat to the city, were slain before the gates, while through fear lest the Romans should force in along with them, they excluded the hindmost of their men by closing the gates. These were the events of that year. The election of military tribunes was approaching, a matter of more intense concern for the patricians than the war itself. They feared that supreme authority was not only shared with the common people, but was almost entirely lost to them. Therefore, the most distinguished individuals, by concerted effort, prepared to stand as candidates. They believed the people would be ashamed to overlook them. Yet the patricians themselves, acting as if they were all candidates, tried every possible means to win over not only men but also the gods. They raised religious objections about the elections held in the 2 preceding years. In the first year, an intolerably severe winter had set in, like a divine omen. In the next year, there were not omens but actual events, a pestilence inflicted on both city and country through the manifest resentment of the gods. As discovered in the books of fate, it was necessary to appease these gods to ward off the plague. It seemed to the gods an affront that honors should be prostituted and the distinctions of birth confounded in an election held under proper auspices. The people, awed by both the dignity of the candidates and a sense of religious duty, elected all the military tribunes with consular power from among the patricians. Most were men highly distinguished by honor: Lucius Valerius Potitus for a 5th time, Marcus Valerius Maximus, Marcus Furius Camillus for a 3rd time, Lucius Furius Metellinus for a 3rd time, Quintus Servilius Fidenas for a 2nd time, and Quintus Sulpicius Camerinus for a 2nd time. During this tribunate, nothing very memorable was achieved at Veii. All their force was employed in laying waste to the countryside. Two accomplished commanders, Titus from Falerii and Camillus from Capena, carried off great booty, leaving nothing undestroyed that could be harmed by sword or fire. Chapter 2: Omens, Prophecies, and Alban Lake. Meanwhile, many omens were announced, most of which were given little credit or even disregarded. This was because individuals were reporting them, and with the Etrurians now at war, there were no aruspices available to interpret them. However, everyone's attention turned to one particular event. The lake in the Alban Grove swelled to an unusual height without any rain or other apparent cause, suggesting a miracle. Commissioners were sent to the Delphic oracle to inquire what the gods pretended by this phenomenon. But an interpreter of fates appeared closer to home in a certain aged Veientian. Amid the jeers thrown out by Roman and Etrurian soldiers from the outposts and guards, this old man declared, in the manner of a prophet, that until the water was discharged from the Alban Lake, the Romans would never become masters of Veii. This was initially disregarded as a random utterance, but it later began to be discussed. Finally, one of the Roman soldiers on guard asked a townsman nearest him, a conversational exchange having now taken place due to the long duration of the war, who the old man was who spoke those dark words concerning the Alban Lake. After learning he was an Aruspex, and being a man with a certain reverence for religion, the Roman soldier pretended he wished to consult him on the expiation of a private omen, hoping the Aruspex could help him. He then enticed the prophet to a conference. When unarmed, they had proceeded a considerable distance from their respective parties without apprehension. The Roman youth, having the advantage in strength, seized the feeble old man in the sight of all. Amid the ineffectual struggle made by the Etrurians, he carried him away to his own party. When the Aruspex was conducted before the general, and then sent from there to Rome to the Senate, those who asked him what he had stated concerning the Alban Lake received this reply: "Undoubtedly the gods were angry with the Veientian people on that day, when they inspired me with the resolve to disclose the ruin of my country, as destined by fate. Therefore, what I then declared, urged by divine inspiration, I neither could recall nor leave unsaid. Perhaps, by concealing what the immortal gods wished to be published, no less guilt was contracted than by openly declaring what ought to be concealed. Thus, it was recorded in the books of fate and in Etrurian doctrine, whenever the Alban water should rise to a great height, then, if the Romans should discharge it in a proper manner, victory would be granted to them over the Veientians. Before that occurred, the gods would not abandon the walls of Veii." He then detailed the legitimate method of draining the lake. However, the Senate, deeming his authority of little weight and not entirely dependable in such an important matter, decided to wait for the deputies and the responses of the Pythian oracle. Before the commissioners returned from Delphi, or an expiation for the Alban prodigy was discovered, the new military tribunes with consular power entered on their office. Lucius Julius Iulus, Lucius Furius Metellinus for the 4th time, Lucius Sergius Fidenas, Aulus Postumius Regilensis, Publius Cornelius Meluginensis, and Aulus Manlius. This year, a new enemy, the Tarquinians, emerged. They observed the Romans engaged in many simultaneous wars, against the Volscians at Anxur, where the garrison was besieged, against the Equins at Lavisae, who were attacking the Roman colony there, and moreover in the Veientian, Faliscan, and Capenatian wars. Additionally, matters were not tranquil within the city walls due to dissensions between the patricians and the common people. Concluding that these troubles presented an opportunity for attack, the Tarquinians sent their light-armed cohorts to commit depredations on Roman territory. They reasoned either that the Romans would allow this injury to pass unavenged, so as not to encumber themselves with an additional war, or that they would retaliate with a small and weak army. The Romans felt more indignation than alarm at the incursions of the Tarquinians. Thus, the matter was neither approached with great preparation, nor was it delayed for long. Aulus Postumius and Lucius Julius raised a body of men, not by a regular levy, for they were prevented by the tribunes of the commons, but mostly of volunteers whom they had roused by exhortations. They proceeded by cross marches through the territory of Caere, and fell unexpectedly on the Tarquinians as they were returning from their depredations, laden with booty. They slew great numbers, stripped them of all their baggage, and having recovered the spoils of their own lands, returned to Rome. 2 days were allowed to the owners to reclaim their effects. On the 3rd day, the unclaimed portion, most of which belonged to the enemies themselves, was sold by public auction, and the proceeds were distributed among the soldiers. The other wars, and especially the Veientian, had uncertain outcomes. Now, despairing of human aid, the Romans began to look to fate and the gods. This was when the deputies returned from Delphi, bringing an oracle's answer that corresponded with the response of the captive prophet. Roman, beware lest the Alban water be confined in the lake. Beware of suffering it to flow into the sea in its own stream. You shall let it out and form a passage for it through the fields, and by dispersing it in channels, you shall consume it. Then press boldly on the walls of the enemy, mindful that victory is granted to you by these fates now revealed over that city you have been besieging for so many years. The war being ended, you, as victorious, shall bring ample offerings to my temples, and having renewed the religious institutions of your country, the care of which has been neglected, perform them in the usual manner. Upon this, the captive prophet began to be held in high esteem. Cornelius and Postumius, the military tribunes, began to employ him for the expiation of the Alban prodigy and to appease the gods in due form. It was at length discovered wherein the gods found fault with the neglect of ceremonies and the omission of customary rites. It was undoubtedly nothing else than that the magistrates, having been appointed under some defect in their election, had not directed the Latin festival and the solemnities on the Alban Mount with due regularity. The only mode of expiation in this case was that the military tribunes should resign their office, the auspices be taken anew, and an interregnum be adopted. All these things were performed according to a decree of the Senate. There were 3 successive interreges: Lucius Valerius, Quintus Servilius Fidenas, and Marcus Furius Camillus. Meanwhile, disturbances never ceased, with the tribunes of the commons impeding the elections until it was previously stipulated that the greater number of the military tribunes should be elected from among the commons. While these events unfolded, assemblies of Etruria were held at the temple of Voltumna. The Capanations and Felicians demanded that all the states of Etruria should, by common consent and resolve, aid in raising the siege of Veii. The answer given was that on a former occasion they had refused that to the Veientians, because they had no right to demand aid from those from whom they had not solicited advice on such an important matter, that for the present their own condition, instead of themselves, denied it to them, especially in that part of Etruria, that a strange nation, the Gauls, had become new neighbors, with whom they neither had a sufficiently secure peace nor a certainty of war. To the blood, however, and the name and the present dangers of their kinsmen, this mark of respect was paid, that if any of their youth were disposed to go to that war, they would not prevent them. Hence, a report spread at Rome that a great number of enemies had arrived, and consequently, the internal dissensions began to subside, as is usual, through alarm for the general safety. Without opposition from the patricians, the prerogative tribe elected Publius Licinius Calvus as military tribune without his seeking the office. He was a man of proven moderation in his former tribunate, but was now of extreme old age. It was observed that all were re-elected in regular succession from the college of the same year: Lucius Titinius, Publius Manius, Publius Maelius, Gnaeus Genutius, and Lucius Attilius. Before these were proclaimed, the tribes being summoned in the ordinary course, Publius Licinius Calvus, with permission of the interrex, spoke as follows: Romans, I perceive that from the recollection of our administration, you are seeking an omen of concord, a thing most important at the present time for the ensuing year. If you re-elect the same colleagues, improved also by experience, in me you no longer behold the same person, but the shadow and name of Publius Licinius now left. The powers of my body have decayed, my senses of sight and hearing have grown dull, my memory falters, the vigor of my mind is blunted. "Behold here a youth," he said, holding his son, "the representation and image of him whom you formerly made a military tribune, the first from among the commons. This youth, formed under my own discipline, I present and dedicate to the commonwealth as a substitute for myself. And I beseech you, Romans, that the honor readily offered by yourselves to me, you would grant to his suit and to my prayers added on his behalf." The favor was granted to the request of the father, and his son, Publius Licinius, was declared military tribune with consular power along with those whom I have mentioned above. Titinius and Genutius, military tribunes, proceeded against the Philicians and Capanations. While conducting the war with more courage than skill, they fell into an ambush. Genutius, atoning for his temerity by an honorable death, fell among the foremost in front of the standards. Titinius, having collected his men from the great confusion into which they were thrown on a rising ground, restored their order of battle. However, he did not venture to engage the enemy on even ground. More disgrace than loss was sustained, which very nearly proved to be a great calamity. So much alarm was excited not only at Rome, where an exaggerated account of it had reached, but in the camp at Veii as well. There, the soldiers were with difficulty restrained from flight, as a report had spread through the camp that the generals and army had been cut to pieces, and that the victorious Capanations and Philicians and all the youth of Etruria were not far off. At Rome, they credited accounts even more alarming than these, that the camp at Veii was now attacked, and that a part of the enemy was now advancing to the city, prepared for an attack. They crowded to the walls, and supplications of the matrons, which the public panic had called forth from their houses, were offered up in the temples. The gods were petitioned by prayers that they would repel destruction from the houses and temples of the city and from the walls of Rome, and that they would avert that terror to Veii, if the sacred rites had been duly renewed, if the prodigies had been expiated. The games and the Latin festival had now been performed anew. The water from the Alban lake had been discharged upon the fields, and the fates were demanding the ruin of Veii. Accordingly, Marcus Furius Camillus, a general destined for the destruction of that city and the preservation of his country, was nominated dictator. He appointed Publius Cornelius Scipio his master of the horse. This change of general suddenly produced a change in every aspect. Their hopes seemed different, the spirits of the people were different, even the fortune of the city seemed changed. First of all, Camillus punished, according to military discipline, those who had fled from Veii in that panic, taking measures to ensure the enemy would not be the most formidable object to the soldiers. Then, a levy being proclaimed for a certain day, he himself made an excursion to Veii to strengthen the spirits of the soldiers. From there, he returned to Rome to enlist the new army, not a single man declining the service. Youth from foreign states also, Latins and Hernicians, came, promising their service for the war. After the dictator thanked them in the Senate, and all preparations for war were completed, he vowed, according to a decree of the Senate, that upon the capture of Veii, he would celebrate the great games and repair and dedicate the temple of Mother Matuta, which had been formerly consecrated by King Servius Tullius. Having set out from the city with his army, amid high expectations rather than mere hopes, he first encountered the Philicians and Capanations in the district of Nepote. Everything there, managed with consummate prudence and skill, was attended, as usual, with success. He not only routed the enemy in battle, but also stripped them of their camp, obtaining a great quantity of spoil. The principal part of this was handed over to the quaestor. Not much was given to the soldiers. From there, the army marched to Veii, and additional forts were erected close to each other. By issuing a proclamation that no one should fight without orders, the soldiers were taken off from random skirmishes between the wall and rampart and applied to the work. Of all the works, by far the greatest and most laborious was a mine they commenced to carry into the enemy's citadel. To ensure the work was not interrupted, and that continuous labor underground would not exhaust the same individuals, he divided the number of pioneers into 6 companies. 6 hours were allotted for the work in rotation. They did not give up, night or day, until they made a passage into the citadel. Chapter 3. The Fall of Veii and its Aftermath. When the dictator now saw that victory was in his hands, that a most opulent city was on the point of being taken, and that there would be more spoil than had been obtained in all previous wars combined, he sent a letter to the Senate. He wished to avoid incurring either the resentment of the soldiers from a parsimonious division of the plunder or displeasure among the patricians from a prodigal lavishing of it. His letter stated that by the kindness of the immortal gods, his own measures, and the perseverance of the soldiers, Veii would soon be in the power of the Roman people. He then asked what they thought should be done with respect to the spoil. Two opinions divided the Senate. The first was that of the elder Publius Licinius, who, it is said, when first asked by his son, proposed that a proclamation should be openly sent forth to the people. Whoever wished to share in the plunder should proceed to the camp before Veii. The other opinion was that of Appius Claudius, who censured such profusion as unprecedented, extravagant, partial, and unadvisable. He argued that if they once judged it criminal, money taken from the enemy should be deposited in the treasury when exhausted by wars. He advised that the soldiers' pay be issued from that money, so that the commons might thereby have to pay less tax. He reasoned that the families of all would feel their share of such a bounty in equal proportion. The hands of the idlers in the city, ever greedy for plunder, would not then carry off the prizes due to brave warriors, as it generally happens that according to each individual's effort in toil and danger, so is he the least active as a plunderer. Licinius, on the other hand, argued that money in that case would always prove a source of jealousy and animosity. It would provide grounds for charges before the commons, leading to seditions and new laws. It was more advisable, he said, that the feelings of the commons should be conciliated by that bounty. Succor should be afforded them, exhausted and drained by attacks of so many years, and they should feel the fruits arising from a war, in which they had, in a manner, grown old. What each took from the enemy with his own hand, and brought home with him, would be more gratifying and delightful than if he were to receive a much larger share at the will of another. He suggested that the dictator himself wished to shun the odium and recriminations arising from the matter, and for that reason he transferred it to the Senate. The Senate, too, ought to hand the matter thus referred to them over to the commons, and allow every man to have what the fortune of war gave to him. This proposition appeared to be safer, as it would make the Senate popular. A proclamation was therefore issued. Those who chose should proceed to the camp to the dictator for the plunder of Veii. The vast multitude who went filled the camp. Then the dictator, going forth after taking the auspices, and having issued orders that the soldiers should take arms, said, "Under your guidance, O Pythian Apollo, and inspired by your divinity, I proceed to destroy the city of Veii, and I vow to you the 10th part of the spoil. You also, Queen Juno, who inhabit Veii, I beseech that you will accompany us, when victors, into our city, soon to be yours, where a temple worthy of your majesty shall receive you." Having offered up these prayers, and with more than a sufficient number of men, he assaulted the city on every quarter to diminish the perception of the danger threatening them from the mine. The Veientians, ignorant that they had already been doomed by their own prophets and foreign oracles, that the gods had been already invited to a share in their plunder, that some, called out by vows from their city, were looking towards the temple of the enemy and new habitations, and that they were spending their last day, fearing nothing less than that their walls were undermined and the citadel was now filled with enemies, briskly ran to the walls in arms, wondering why, when no one had stirred from the Roman posts for so many days, they should then, as if struck with sudden fury, run heedlessly to the walls. A fabulous narrative is introduced here, that when the king of the Veientians was offering sacrifice, the voice of the Uruspecs, declaring that the victory was given to him who should cut up the entrails of that victim, having been heard in the mine, incited the Roman soldiers to burst open the mine, carry off the entrails, and bring them to the dictator. But in matters of such remote antiquity, I should deem it sufficient if matters bearing a resemblance to truth are admitted as true. Such stories as this, more suited to display on the stage, which delights in the marvelous, than to historic authenticity, are not worth affirming or refuting. The mine, at this time full of chosen men, suddenly discharged the armed troops in the temple of Juno, which was in the citadel of Veii. Some of them attacked the rear of the enemy on the walls, some tore open the bars of the gates, some set fire to the houses, while stones and tiles were thrown down from the roofs by the women and slaves. Clamor, consisting of the various voices of the assailants and the terrified, mixed with the crying of women and children, filled every place. The soldiers were instantly beaten off from the walls, and the gates being thrown open, some entering in bodies, others scaling the deserted walls, the city became filled with enemies, and fighting took place in every quarter. Then, much slaughter being now made, the ardor of the fight abated. The dictator commanded the heralds to proclaim that the unarmed should be spared. This put an end to bloodshed. Then, laying down their arms, they commenced to surrender. By permission of the dictator, the soldiers dispersed in quest of plunder. And when this was collected before his eyes, greater in quantity and in the value of the effects than he had hoped or expected, the dictator, raising his hands to heaven, is said to have prayed that, if his success and that of the Roman people seemed excessive to any of the gods and men, it might be permitted to the Roman people to appease that jealousy with as little detriment as possible to himself and the Roman people. It is recorded that, when turning about during this prayer, he stumbled and fell. To persons judging the matter by subsequent events, that seemed to refer as an omen to Camillus' own condemnation and the disaster of the city of Rome, which happened a few years after. That day was consumed in slaughtering the enemy and in the plunder of this most opulent city. On the following day, the dictator sold the inhabitants of free condition by auction. That was the only money applied to public use, not without resentment on the part of the people. For the spoil they brought home with them, they felt no obligation either to their commander, who, in his search for abettors of his own parsimony, had referred to the Senate a matter within his own jurisdiction, or to the Senate. Instead, they felt an obligation to the Licinian family, of which the son had laid the matter before the Senate, and the father had been the proposer of such a popular resolution. When all human wealth had been carried away from Veii, they then began to remove the offerings to their gods and the gods themselves, but more after the manner of worshippers than of plunderers. For youths selected from the entire army, to whom the charge of conveying Queen Juno to Rome was assigned, after having thoroughly washed their bodies and arrayed themselves in white garments, entered her temple with profound adoration, applying their hands at first with religious awe, because according to the Etruscan usage, no one but a priest of a certain family had been accustomed to touch that statue. Then, when someone, moved either by divine inspiration or in youthful jocularity, said, "Juno, are you willing to go to Rome?" the rest joined in shouting that the goddess had nodded assent. To the story, an addition was afterwards made, that her voice was heard, declaring that she was willing. Certainly, we are informed that, having been raised from her place by machines of trifling power, she was light and easily removed, as if she willingly followed. She was conveyed safe to the Aventine, her eternal seat, whither the vows of the dictator had invited her, where the same Camillus who had vowed it afterwards dedicated a temple to her. Such was the fall of Veii, the wealthiest city of the Etruscan nation, which even in its final overthrow demonstrated its greatness. For having been besieged for 10 summers and winters without intermission, after it had inflicted considerably greater losses than it had sustained, eventually, fate now at length urging its destruction, it was carried after all by the contrivances of art, not by force. When news reached Rome that Veii was taken, the city erupted in unbounded joy, as if for an unexpected event. This was despite the expiation of prodigies, the well-known answers of prophets, and the Pythian responses. Furthermore, they had selected Marcus Furius, the greatest general of the day, a choice that promised success through human prudence. Before the Senate could pass any decree, all the temples were crowded with Roman matrons giving thanks to the gods. The Senate decreed supplications for 4 days, a duration greater than in any former war. The dictator's arrival, with all ranks pouring out to meet him, was more attended than that of any general before, and his triumph considerably surpassed all ordinary honors for such a day. The most conspicuous aspect was Camillus himself, riding through the city in a chariot drawn by white horses. This appeared unbecoming, not to say for a citizen, but even for a human being. The people considered it an outrage on religion that the dictator's equipment should emulate that of Jupiter and Apollo. For this single reason, his triumph was more splendid than pleasing. He then contracted for a temple for Queen Juno on Mount Aventine and consecrated that of Mother Matuta. After performing these services to the gods and to mankind, he laid down his dictatorship. They then began to consider the offering to Apollo. When Camillus stated that he had vowed the 10th part of the spoil to him, and the pontiff declared that the people ought to discharge their own obligation, a plan was not readily struck out for ordering the people to refund the spoil, so that the due proportion might be set aside for sacred purposes. At length, they resorted to what seemed the easiest course. Whoever wished to acquit himself and his family of the religious obligation, after making his own estimate of his portion of the plunder, should pay into the treasury the value of the 10th part. This would allow a golden offering, worthy of the grandeur of the temple and the divinity of the god, and suitable to the dignity of the Roman people, to be made. This contribution also tended to alienate the affections of the commons from Camillus. During these transactions, ambassadors came from the Volscians and Equins to sue for peace. Peace was obtained, rather to allow the state, wearied by so tedious a war, to obtain repose, than because the petitioners were deserving of it. After the capture of Veii, the following year had 6 military tribunes with consular power: the 2 Publii Cornelii, Cassus and Scipio, Marcus Valerius Maximus a 2nd time, Ciso Fabius Ambustus a 3rd time, Lucius Furius Metellinus a 5th time, and Quintus Servilius a 3rd time. To the Cornelii fell the Cilician War by lot, to Valerius and Servilius the Capinatian War. They did not attempt to storm or besiege any cities, but the countryside was laid waste, and the plunder of effects on the lands was driven off. Not a single fruit tree, not a vegetable was left. These losses reduced the people of Capena, and peace was granted to them upon their suing for it. The war among the Cilicians still continued. At Rome, in the meantime, sedition multiplied. To assuage this, they resolved that a colony should be sent off to the Volscian country, for which 3,000 Roman citizens should be enrolled. The triumvirs appointed for the purpose distributed 3 7/12 acres to each man. This donation began to be scorned, as they thought it was offered as a solace for the disappointment of higher hopes. For why were the commons to be sent into exile to the Volscians, when the magnificent city of Veii was still in view, and the Veientian territory, more fertile and extensive than the Roman territory? The city they extolled as preferable to the city of Rome, both in situation, in the grandeur of its enclosures, and its public and private buildings. Indeed, even the scheme was proposed, which after the taking of Rome by the Gauls was still more strongly urged, of moving to Veii. But they destined Veii to be inhabited by half the commons and half the Senate, so that 2 cities of one common republic might be inhabited by the Roman people. When the nobles strove against these measures so strenuously as to declare that they would sooner die in the sight of the Roman people than that any of these things should be put to the vote, for that now in one city there were so many dissensions, what would there be in 2? Would anyone prefer a vanquished to a victorious city, and suffer Veii now, after being captured, to enjoy greater prosperity than it had before its capture? Lastly, that they may be forsaken in their country by their fellow citizens, that no power should ever oblige them to forsake their country and fellow citizens, and follow Titus Licinius, for he was the tribune of the commons who proposed the measure, as a founder to Veii, abandoning the divine Romulus, the son of a god, the parent and founder of the city of Rome. When these proceedings were going on with shameful contentions, for the patricians had drawn over 1/2 of the tribunes of the commons to their sentiments, nothing else obliged the commons to refrain from violence, but that whenever a clamor was set up for commencing a riot, the principal members of the Senate, presenting themselves among the foremost to the crowd, ordered that they themselves should be attacked, struck, and put to death. While they abstained from violating their age, dignity, and honorable station, Their respect for them checked their rage, even with respect to similar attempts on others. Camillus, at every opportunity and in all places, stated publicly that this was not at all surprising, that the state was gone mad, which, though bound by a vow, yet felt greater concern in all other matters than in acquitting itself of its religious obligations. He would say nothing of the contribution of an alms more strictly speaking than of a tenth, since each man bound himself in his private capacity by it. The public was set free. However, that his conscience would not permit him to pass this over in silence, that out of that spoil only which consisted of movable effects, a tenth was set apart, that no mention was made of the city and captured land, which were also included in the vow. As the discussion of this point seemed difficult to the Senate, it was referred to the pontiffs. Camillus being invited to the council, the college decided that whatever had belonged to the Veientians before the uttering of the vow, and had come into the power of the Roman people after the vow was made, of that a tenth part was sacred to Apollo. Thus the city and land were brought into the estimate. Money was issued from the treasury, and the consular tribunes of the soldiers were commissioned to purchase gold with it. When there was not a sufficient quantity of this metal, the matrons, having held meetings to deliberate on the subject, and by a general resolution having promised the military tribunes their gold and all their ornaments, brought them into the treasury. This circumstance was peculiarly grateful to the Senate, and they say that in return for this generosity, the honor was conferred on the matrons that they might use covered chariots when going to public worship and the games, and open chaises on festivals and common days. A certain weight of gold being received from each and valued, in order that the price might be paid for it, it was resolved that a golden bowl should be made of it, which was to be carried to Delphi as an offering to Apollo. As soon as they disengaged their minds from the religious obligation, the tribunes of the commons renewed their seditious practices. The populace were excited against all the nobles, but above all against Camillus, saying that he, by confiscating and consecrating the plunder of Veii, had reduced it to nothing. The absent nobles abused in violent terms. They evinced a respect for them in their presence, when they voluntarily presented themselves to their fury. As soon as they perceived that the business would be protracted beyond that year, they re-elected as tribunes of the commons for the following year the same abetas of the law. The patricians strove to accomplish the same thing with respect to those who were opponents of the law. Thus, the same persons in a great measure were re-elected tribunes of the commons. At the election of military tribunes, the patricians succeeded by their utmost exertions in having Marcus Furius Camillus elected. They pretended that he was wanted as a commander on account of the wars, but he was intended as an opponent to the tribunes in their profusion. The military tribunes with consular authority elected with Camillus were Lucius Furius Metellinus a sixth time, Caius Aemilius, Lucius Valerius Publicola, Spurius Postumius, Publius Cornelius a second time. At the commencement of the year, the tribunes of the commons took not a step until Marcus Furius Camillus should set out to the Philicians, as that war had been assigned to him. Then, by delaying, the project cooled, and Camillus, whom they chiefly dreaded as an antagonist, acquired an increase of glory among the Philicians. For when the enemy at first confined themselves within the walls, considering it the safest plan, by laying waste their lands and burning their houses, he compelled them to come forth from the city. But their fears prevented them from proceeding to any considerable length. At about a mile from the town they pitched their camp, trusting that it was sufficiently secure, for no other reason than the difficulty of the approaches, the roads around being rough and craggy, in some parts narrow, in others steep. But Camillus, having followed the direction of a prisoner belonging to the country as his guide, decamping at an advanced hour of the night, at break of day showed himself on ground considerably higher than theirs. The Romans worked at the fortifications in 3 divisions. The rest of the army stood prepared for battle. There he routed and put to flight the enemy when they attempted to interrupt his works. Such terror was struck into the Philicians in consequence that, in their precipitate flight, passing by their own camp which lay in their way, they made for the city. Many were slain and wounded before, in their panic, they could make their way through the gates. Their camp was taken, The spoil was given up to the quaestors, to the great dissatisfaction of the soldiers. But, overcome by the strictness of his authority, they both hated and admired the same firmness of conduct. Then a regular siege of the city took place, and the lines of circumvallation were carried on, and sometimes occasional attacks were made by the townsmen on the Roman posts, and slight skirmishes took place. The time was spent, no hope of success inclining to either side, while corn and other provisions were possessed in much greater abundance by the besieged than the besiegers, from the store which had been previously laid in. Their toil appeared likely to prove just as tedious as it had at Veii, had not fortune presented to the Roman general at once both an opportunity for displaying his virtuous firmness of mind, already tested in warlike affairs, and a speedy victory. Among the Philicians, it was customary for the same individual to serve as both preceptor and private tutor for their children. As is still common in Greece, several youths were entrusted to one man's care. The person who excelled in knowledge naturally instructed the children of the leading citizens. During peacetime, he had made it a habit to take the boys outside the city for play and exercise. This custom continued even during the war. Leading them away from the city gate, sometimes on shorter, sometimes on longer excursions, he advanced farther than usual. When an opportunity arose, by varying their games and conversation, he led them past the enemy's guards, directly to the Roman camp, and into Camillus's tent. There, to this atrocious act, he added an even more outrageous statement, that he had delivered Falerii into the hands of the Romans by putting into their power these children, whose parents are there at the head of affairs. Upon hearing this, Camillus declared, "Wicked as you have come with your villainous offering to neither a people nor a commander like yourself. Between us and the Philicians, there exists no societal compact formed by human agreement. But between us both there does exist, and ever will exist, that which nature has implanted. There are laws of war as well as peace, and we have learned to wage them justly, no less than bravely. We bear arms not against that age which is spared even when towns are taken, but against men who are themselves armed, and who, unprovoked by us, attacked the Roman camp at Veii. You have surpassed them, as far as they lay within you, by an unprecedented act of villainy. I shall conquer them, as I did Veii, by Roman virtues, by bravery, labor, and by arms." Then, stripping the tutor naked and tying his hands behind his back, Camillus delivered him to the boys to be brought back to Falerii. He supplied them with rods to scourge the traitor and drive him into the city. At this spectacle, a crowd assembled, and afterwards the Senate, convened by the magistrates, witnessed an extraordinary change in sentiment. The entire state earnestly demanded peace from those who, only recently, fueled by hatred and anger, almost preferred the fate of the Veientians to the peace of the Capenations. The Roman faith and the justice of their commander were praised in the Forum and the Senate House. By universal consent, ambassadors set out to Camillus's camp, and from there, with his permission, to Rome, to the Senate, to surrender Falerii. Introduced before the Senate, they are recorded as having spoken thus: "Conscript fathers, overcome by you and your commander through a victory at which neither God nor man can feel displeasure, we surrender ourselves to you. We believe we shall live more happily under your rule than under our own law, a state of affairs more glorious for a conqueror. In the outcome of this war, two salutary examples have been shown to mankind. You preferred faith in war to immediate victory. We, moved by your good faith, have voluntarily yielded the victory to you. We are under your sovereignty. Send men to receive our arms, our hostages, our city with its gates thrown open. You shall never have cause to regret our fidelity, nor we your dominion." Thanks were returned to Camillus by both the enemy and his own countrymen. Money was demanded from the Philicians to pay the soldiers for that year, relieving the Roman people from the tribute. Peace granted, the army returned to Rome. When Camillus returned home, his glory was far more substantial than when white horses had drawn him through the city. He had vanquished the enemy through justice and good faith. The Senate did not conceal their respect for him, but immediately set about fulfilling his vow. Lucius Valerius, Lucius Sergius, and Aulus Manlius were sent in a warship as ambassadors to carry a golden bowl to Delphi as an offering to Apollo. They were intercepted by pirates of the Liprenses, not far from the Sicilian Strait, and taken to Lipara. It was the custom of that state to divide all acquired booty, essentially through public piracy. That year, Timesitheus held the office of chief magistrate, a man more akin to the Romans than his own countrymen. He, reverencing the name of the ambassadors, the offering, the god to whom it was sent, and the cause of the offering, also impressed the multitude, who almost always resemble their ruler, with a sense of religious justice. After hosting the ambassadors at a public entertainment, he escorted them with a fleet of ships to Delphi, and from there brought them back safely to Rome. By a decree of the Senate, a league of hospitality was formed with him, and presents were conferred upon him by the state. During the same year, the war with the Equins proceeded with varying success, leaving doubt among the troops and in Rome as to whether they had been victorious or defeated. The Roman commanders were Caius Aemilius and Spurius Postumius, two military tribunes. Initially, they acted in conjunction. After routing the enemy in the field, it was agreed that Aemilius would occupy Verrugo with a certain force, and Postumius would devastate the countryside. There, as Postumius proceeded somewhat negligently, and with his troops irregularly formed, he was attacked by the Equins. A sudden alarm drove him to the nearest hill, and the panic spread from there to Verrugo, affecting the other detachment of the army. After Postumius withdrew his men to safety, he summoned an assembly and rebuked them for their fright and flight, for having been beaten by a cowardly enemy. The entire army shouted aloud that they deserved to hear all this, admitting the disgrace they had incurred. But they promised to make amends, and that the enemy's joy would not last long. Demanding that he instantly lead them to the enemy's camp, which lay in the plain within their view, they submitted to any punishment if they did not take it before night. Praising them, he ordered them to take refreshment and be ready at the fourth watch. The enemy, to prevent the Romans from escaping the hill via the road to Verrugo, had positioned themselves to meet them. The battle began before daylight, with the moon still up throughout the night, and was no more confused than a daytime battle. But the shout reached Verrugo, causing such a panic among Aemilius's detachment that, despite his pleas and efforts to stop them, they fled in great disorder to Tusculum. From there, a report reached Rome that Postumius and his army were cut to pieces. When dawn dispelled any apprehension of an ambush in case of a hasty pursuit, Postumius rode through the ranks, demanding the fulfillment of their promises. He infused such ardor into them that the Equins could no longer withstand their impetuosity. The subsequent slaughter during their flight, conducted more out of anger than courage, continued until the total destruction of the enemy. The distressing news from Tusculum, which had needlessly alarmed the state, was then followed by a letter from Postumius, adorned with laurel, announcing that the victory belonged to the Roman people, that the army of the Equins was destroyed. As the proceedings of the plebeian tribunes had not yet concluded, the common people strove to continue the office for the law's proponents, while the patricians sought to re-elect its opponents. However, the commons were more successful in electing their own magistrates. The patricians avenged this annoyance by passing a Senate decree that consuls, magistrates detested by the commons, should be elected. After a 15-year interval, Lucius Lucretius Flavus and Servius Sulpicius Camerinus were appointed consuls. At the beginning of this year, while the tribunes of the commons united their efforts to pass the law, with no one in their college likely to oppose them, and the consuls resisted with equal energy, the Equins stormed Vitellia, a Roman colony in their territory. Most of the colonists made their way safely to Rome because the town, taken by treachery in the night, offered an unimpeded escape route from the remote side of the city. That province fell to the lot of Consul Lucius Lucretius. Setting out with his army, he vanquished the enemy in the field and returned victorious to Rome for a much more serious contest. A day of trial had been appointed for Aulus Virginius and Quintus Pomponius, plebeian tribunes of the 2 preceding years. In their defense, supported by the combined power of the patricians, the honor of the Senate was at stake. For no one laid against them any other impeachment, either of their way of life or their conduct in office, except that, to gratify the patricians, they had protested against the tribunician law. The resentment of the commons, however, prevailed over the influence of the Senate. By a most pernicious precedent, these innocent men were condemned to pay a fine of 10,000 asses. At this, the patricians were very much incensed. Camillus openly charged the commons with gross violation of duty. He argued that, now turning their venom against their own body, they did not feel that by their iniquitous sentence on the tribunes they abolished the right of protesting, that by abolishing this right they had upset the tribunician authority. For they were mistaken in expecting that the patricians would tolerate the unbridled licentiousness of that office. If tribunician violence could not be repelled by tribunician aid, the patricians would find some other weapon. He also blamed the consuls for silently allowing those tribunes who had followed the Senate's authority to be betrayed by their reliance on public faith. By openly expressing these sentiments, he daily further exacerbated the people's anger. But he ceased not to urge the Senate to oppose the law. He insisted that, when the day for proposing the law arrived, they should go down to the forum with no other feeling than as men who remembered that they had to contend for their altars and homes, and the temples of the gods, and the soil in which they had been born. For as far as he himself individually was concerned, if during this contest to be sustained by his country, it were allowable for him to think of his own glory, it would even reflect honor on himself, that a city captured by him should be densely inhabited, that he would daily enjoy the monument of his glory, and that he would have before his eyes a city borne by him in his triumph, that all would tread in the footsteps of his renown, but that he deemed it an impiety that a city deserted and forsaken by the immortal gods should be inhabited, that the Roman people should reside in a captive soil, and that a vanquished should be taken in exchange for a victorious country. Stimulated by these exhortations from their leader, the patricians, both young and old, entered the forum in a body when the law was about to be proposed. Dispersing themselves through the tribes, each earnestly appealed to the members of their own tribe, imploring them with tears not to desert that country for which they themselves and their fathers had fought most valiantly and successfully. They pointed to the capital, the temple of Vesta, and the other temples of the gods around, urging them not to drive the Roman people, exiles and outcasts, from their native soil and household gods into the city of the enemy, and not to bring matters to such a state that it was better that Veii were not taken, lest Rome should be deserted. Because they proceeded not by violence but by entreaties, and amidst these entreaties frequent mention was made of the gods, the greatest part of the people were influenced by religious scruples. More tribes rejected the law than voted for it. So gratifying was this victory to the patricians that on the following day, on a motion made by the consuls, a Senate decree was passed that 7 acres of Veii territory should be distributed to the commons. This was to be given not only to the fathers of families, but also considering all free persons in their household, encouraging them to raise their children with that prospect. The commons, swayed by such a generous gift, made no opposition to holding the consular elections. Lucius Valerius Potitus and Marcus Manlius, later known as Capitolinus, were elected consuls. These consuls celebrated the great games that Marcus Furius, as dictator, had vowed during the Veientian War. In the same year, the temple of Imperial Juno, also vowed by the same dictator during that war, was dedicated. It is said that matrons attended the dedication with great enthusiasm. A war scarcely worth mentioning was waged with the equins at Algidum, the enemy fleeing almost before the fight began. Valerius, for his persistence in pursuing and slaughtering them, was granted a triumph. Manlius was decreed an ovation upon entering the city. That same year, a new war erupted with the Volsinians. However, an army could not be led there due to a famine and pestilence in Roman territories, caused by drought and excessive heat. Because of this, the Volsinians, joining with the Salpinians, grew arrogant and made an unprovoked incursion into Roman territory. War was then declared against both states. Caius Julius died during his censorship. Marcus Cornelius was substituted in his place. This act was later considered religiously offensive, as Rome was captured during that very lustrum. Since that time, a censor has never been substituted for one who died in office. With the consuls also afflicted by the illness, it was decided that the auspices should be taken anew during an interregnum. Therefore, in accordance with a Senate decree, the consuls resigned their office. Marcus Furius Camillus was created by Interrex, who then appointed Publius Cornelius Scipio as Interrex. Scipio, in turn, appointed Lucius Valerius Potitus. By him, 6 military tribunes with consular power were appointed. This ensured that, even if one were incapacitated by illness, the state would have a sufficient number of magistrates. On the calends of July, the following entered office: Lucius Lucretius, Servius Sulpicius, Marcus Aemilius, Lucius Furius Metellinus for a 7th time, Agrippa Furius, and Caius Aemilius for a 2nd time. Of these, Lucius Lucretius and Caius Aemilius were assigned the Volsinians as their province. The Salpinians fell to Agrippa Furius and Servius Sulpicius. The first engagement was with the Volsinians. This war, significant due to the enemy's numbers, was swiftly concluded. At the first onset, their army was put to flight. 8,000 soldiers, surrounded by cavalry, laid down their arms and surrendered. News of this war prevented the Salpinians from risking an engagement. Their troops secured themselves within their towns. The Romans drove spoils in every direction from both Salpinian and Volsinian territory, with no one to repel their aggression. Eventually, a truce for 20 years was granted to the Volsinians, exhausted by the war, on the condition that they make restitution to the Roman people and furnish the army's pay for that year. During the same year, Marcus Caedicius, a plebeian, announced to the tribunes that in the new street, where the chapel now stands, above the temple of Vesta, he had heard in the silence of the night a voice louder than human, which ordered the magistrates to be told that the Gauls were approaching. This warning, as is common, was disregarded due to the humble station of the messenger, and because the nation was a distant and therefore lesser-known people. Not only were the warnings of the gods disregarded, with fate now impending, but further, the only human aid remaining to them, Marcus Furius, drove away from the city. On a trial day appointed for him by Lucius Apuleius, a tribune of the people, concerning the Veientian spoil, and having also lost his young son around the same time, Camillus summoned the members of his tribe and his dependents, who constituted a considerable portion of the commons. Sounding their sentiments, he received the answer that they would contribute whatever fine he was condemned to pay, but they were unable to acquit him. Camillus then retired into exile, praying to the immortal gods that, if that outrage was done to him without his deserving it, they would at the earliest opportunity give cause to his ungrateful country to regret his absence. In his absence, he was fined 15,000 asses. Chapter 4: Gallic Incursions and Roman Disaster. That citizen being driven away, a citizen whose presence, if anything is certain regarding human affairs, would have prevented Rome from being captured, the destined ruin now approached the city. Ambassadors came from the Closinians, soliciting aid against the Gauls. A report circulates that this nation, enticed by the delightful crops and especially the wine, an enjoyment then new to them, crossed the Alps and took possession of lands formerly cultivated by the Etrurians. It is said that Aruns, a native of Clusium, introduced wine into Gaul to lure the nation, out of resentment for his wife having been debauched by Lucumo, a very influential young man whose guardian Aruns himself had been. Vengeance could not be taken unless foreign aid was resorted to. These Aruns supposedly served as a guide when they crossed the Alps and advised them to lay siege to Clusium. I would not deny that the Gauls were brought to Clusium by Aruns or any other native of Clusium, but that those persons who laid siege to Clusium were not they who first crossed the Alps is sufficiently certain. For 200 years before they laid siege to Clusium and captured the city of Rome, the Gauls passed over into Italy. Nor were these the first Etrurians with whom the Gauls fought. Long before that, they frequently fought with those who dwelt between the Apennines and the Alps. Before the Roman Empire, the sway of the Tuscans was much extended by land and by sea. How powerful they were in the upper and lower seas, by which Italy is encompassed like an island, is evidenced by the names of these seas. 1. The Italian nations called the Tuscan Sea, a general appellation for the people. The other, the Adriatic, from Hadria, a colony of Tuscans. The Greeks call these same seas the Tyrrhenian and Adriatic. These people inhabited the country extending to both seas in 12 cities, sending colonies equal in number to the mother cities, first on this side of the Apennines towards the lower sea, then to the other side of the Apennines. They obtained possession of all the districts beyond the Po, even as far as the Alps, except the corner of the Venetians, who dwell around the extreme point of the Adriatic Sea. The Alpine nations also share this origin, especially the Rhaetians, whom their very situation has rendered savage, so as to retain nothing of their original tongue, except the accent, and not even that without corruption. Concerning the passage of the Gauls into Italy, we have heard the following account. In the reign of Tarquinius Priscus at Rome, the supreme government of the Celts, which comprised the third part of Gaul, was in the hands of the Biturigians. They gave a king to the Celtic nation, Ambigatus, a man very much distinguished by his merit, and both his great prosperity in his own concerns and in those of the public. Under his administration, Gaul was so fruitful and so well populated that such a vast population appeared scarcely capable of being restrained by any government. Now advanced in years and anxious to relieve his kingdom of such an oppressive crowd, he declared his intention to send his sister's sons, Bellovesus and Sigovesus, 2 enterprising youths, into whatever settlements the gods should grant them by augury. They were to take with them as great a number of men as they pleased, so that no nation might be able to obstruct their progress. The oracle assigned the Hercynian forest to Sigovesus. To Bellovesus, the gods marked out a much more cheering route into Italy. He led out from the Biturigians, the Arvernians, the Senonians, the Eguans, the Ambarians, the Carnutians, and the Aulurtians, all that was superfluous in their population. Having set out with an immense force of horse and foot, he arrived in the country of the Tricastinians. Next, the Alps blocked their progress. I am not surprised that they seemed impassable, as they had never been climbed by any known path, at least as far as tradition extends, unless we are disposed to believe the stories regarding Hercules. When the height of the mountains held the Gauls penned up, as it were, and they were looking around to discover by what path they might pass into another world between the sky-joining summits, a religious scruple detained them. It had been announced that strangers in search of lands were attacked by the nation of the Salians. These were the Massilians, who had come by sea from Phocea. The Gauls, considering this an omen of their own fortune, assisted them in fortifying the ground they had taken possession of on their first landing, which was covered with spacious woods. They themselves crossed the Alps through the Tyrrhenian and pathless forests. Having defeated the Etrurians not far from the Ticinus, upon hearing that the land in which they had posted themselves was called Insubria, the same name as the Insubras, a canton of the Aedui, they embraced the omen of the place. They built a city there and called it Mediolanum. Some time later, another body, consisting of Cenomanians, followed the tracks of the former under the conduct of Elatovius. They crossed the Alps through the same forest, with the aid of Bellovesus, and settled where the cities of Brixia and Verona now stand. The Libyans then possessed these places. After these came the Salluvians, who established themselves near the ancient canton of the Ligurians called Livy, inhabiting the banks of the Ticinus. Next, the Boians and Lingonians, having made their way over through the Pennine Pass, occupied all the tract between the Po and the Alps. They crossed the Po on rafts and drove out of the country not only the Etrurians, but the Umbrians also. They confined themselves, however, within the Apennines. Then the Senonians, the latest of these emigrants, took possession of the tract extending from the Eutans to the Isis. I find that it was this nation that came to Clusium and then to Rome. Whether alone, or aided by all the nations of the Cisalpine Gauls, is not duly ascertained. The Clusians, terrified by their strange enemy, beholding their great numbers, the forms of the men they had never seen, and the kind of arms they carried, and hearing that Etrurian troops had been frequently defeated by them on both sides of the Po, sent ambassadors to Rome to solicit aid from the Senate. This was despite having no claim on the Roman people in respect of either alliance or friendship, except that they had not defended their relatives, the Veientians, against the Roman people. No direct aid was obtained. Instead, 3 ambassadors were sent, sons of Marcus Fabius Ambustus, to negotiate with the Gauls in the name of the Senate and Roman people. They were to request that the Gauls not attack the allies and friends of the Roman people, from whom they had received no wrong. The ambassadors were to state that the Romans would support their allies even by force of arms if circumstances obliged them, but it seemed better that war itself be kept at bay, if possible, and that the Gauls, a nation strange to them, should be known by peace rather than by arms. The Roman embassy, intended to be mild, was unfortunately entrusted to ambassadors too hot-tempered, resembling Gauls more than Romans. When they delivered their commission to the assembly of the Gauls, this answer was returned: "Though the name of the Romans is new to our ears, we believe them to be brave men, whose aid the Clusians implore in their peril. Since you choose to defend your allies by negotiation rather than by arms, we, for our part, will not reject your pacific terms. However, the Clusians must surrender to the Gauls, who are in need of land, a portion of their territories that they possess to a greater extent than they can cultivate. Otherwise, peace cannot be obtained. We wish to receive an answer in the presence of the Romans. If the land is refused, we will decide the matter with the sword, in the presence of these same Romans, so that you may carry home an account of how much the Gauls excel all other mortals in bravery." When the Romans asked what right the Gauls had to demand land from its possessors or to threaten war, and what business the Gauls had in Etruria, the Gauls fiercely replied that they carried their right in their swords, and that all things were the property of the brave. With minds inflamed on both sides, they each resorted to arms, and battle commenced. Here, with fate pressing hard on the Roman city, the ambassadors, contrary to the law of nations, took up arms. This could not be done in secret, as 3 of the noblest and bravest Roman youths fought in the vanguard of the Etrurians. So conspicuous was the valor of the foreigners. Moreover, Quintus Fabius, riding out beyond the line, slew a Gallic general who was furiously charging the Etrurian standards, having run him through the side with his spear. The Gauls recognized him when stripping him of his spoils, and a signal was given throughout the entire line that he was a Roman ambassador. Giving up their resentment against the Clusians, they sounded a retreat, threatening the Romans. Some were of the opinion that they should proceed forthwith to Rome. However, the seniors prevailed, deciding that ambassadors should be sent to complain of the injuries done to them and to demand that the Fabii be given up in satisfaction for having violated the law of nations. When the ambassadors stated their case according to instructions, the Senate neither approved of the Fabii's conduct, nor did the barbarians' demands seem unjust. But in the case of men of such high station, party favor prevented them from decreeing what they felt was right. Therefore, lest the blame for any misfortune that might occur in a war with the Gauls should lie with them, they referred the consideration of the Gauls' demands to the people. There, influence and wealth were so predominant that those whose punishment was under consideration were elected military tribunes with consular power for the ensuing year. At this proceeding, the Gauls, as was very natural, were enraged. Openly menacing war, they returned to their own party. With the 3 Fabii, the military tribunes elected were Quintus Sulpicius Longus, Quintus Servilius for a 4th time, and Servius Cornelius Meluginensis. Though danger of such magnitude was impending, so completely does fortune blind the minds of men when she wishes not her threatening stroke to be foiled. A state that against the Fidenatian and Veientian enemies and other neighboring states had sought aid even from the most distant quarters, and had appointed a dictator on many trying occasions, that same state now, when an enemy never before seen or heard of, from the ocean and remotest regions of the earth, was advancing in arms against them, looked not for any extraordinary command or aid. Tribunes, by whose temerity the war had been brought upon them, were appointed to the chief direction of affairs. Even making less of the war than fame had represented it, they held the levy with no greater diligence than was customary for ordinary wars. In the meantime, the Gauls, hearing that honor was even conferred on the violators of human law, and that their embassy was slighted, inflamed with resentment, over which that nation has no control, immediately snatched up their standards and began their march with the utmost expedition. As cities, alarmed by the tumult they caused in their hurried passage, began to arm themselves and peasants fled, the Gauls indicated by a loud shout that they were proceeding to Rome, covering an immense space of ground wherever they passed with their widely spread horses and men. But fame, and the messengers from Clusium, and then from other states one after another, preceded them. The enemy's rapid advance brought the greatest consternation to Rome, for with their hastily assembled troops, they met the Romans within the distance of the 11th milestone, where the river Allia, descending from the Crustuminian mountains in a very deep channel, joins the river Tiber not far below the road. Already, all the places in front and on each side were crowded with the enemy. This nation, with a natural turn for causeless confusion, filled all places with a horrible din through their harsh music and discordant clamors. There, the military tribunes, without having previously selected a place for their camp, without having previously raised a rampart to which they might retreat, unmindful of their duty to the gods, let alone to man, without taking auspices or offering sacrifices, drew up their line. This line was extended towards the flanks, lest they be surrounded by the great numbers of the enemy. Still, their front could not be made equal to that of the enemy, though by thinning their line they rendered their center weak and scarcely connected. There was on the right a small eminence, which it was determined to fill with bodies of reserve. That circumstance, as it was the first cause of their dismay and flight, so it proved their only means of safety in their flight. For Brennus, the chieftain of the Gauls, being chiefly apprehensive of some design intended in the small number of the enemy, thinking that the high ground had been seized for this purpose, that when the Gauls had been engaged in front with the line of the legions, the reserve was to make an attack on their rear and flank, directed his troops against the reserve. He was certain that if he had dislodged them from their ground, the victory would be easy in the plain for a force which had so much advantage in numbers. Thus, not only fortune, but judgment also stood on the side of the barbarians. In the opposite army, nothing like Romans appeared, either in the commanders or in the soldiers. Terror and dismay had taken possession of their minds, and such a forgetfulness of everything that a far greater number of them fled to Veii, a city of their enemy, though the Tiber stood in their way, than by the direct road to Rome, to their wives and children. Their position defended the reserve for some time. Throughout the remainder of the line, as soon as the shout was heard, by those who stood nearest on their flank, and by those at a distance on their rear, almost before they could look at the enemy, yet untried, not only without attempting to fight, but without even returning the shout, fresh and unhurt, they took to flight. Nor was there any slaughter of them in the act of fighting, but their rear was cut to pieces while they obstructed each other's flight. A great slaughter was made on the bank of the Tiber, where the entire left wing, having thrown down their arms, directed their flight. Many who did not know how to swim, or were exhausted, weighed down by their coats of mail and other defensive armor, were swallowed up in the current. The greatest part, however, escaped safely to Veii. From there, not only no reinforcement, but not even an account of their defeat, was forwarded to Rome. Those on the right wing, which had been posted at a distance from the river and rather near the foot of the mountain, all made for Rome and, without even shutting the gates, fled into the citadel. The miraculous attainment of so sudden a victory held even the Gauls in a state of stupefaction. At first, they stood motionless with panic, as if not knowing what had happened. Then they apprehended a stratagem. At length, they began to collect the spoils of the slain and to pile up the arms in heaps, as is their custom. Then at last, when no appearance of anything hostile was observed anywhere, having proceeded on their journey, they reached the city of Rome not long before sunset. When some horsemen who had advanced ahead brought back word that the gates were not shut, that no guard was posted before the gates, and no armed troops on the walls, another cause of amazement, similar to the former, made them halt. Dreading the night and their ignorance of the city's layout, They posted themselves between Rome and the Anio after sending scouts around the walls and the several gates to ascertain what plans the enemy would adopt in their desperate circumstances. As for the Romans, since the greater part had gone to Veii from the battlefield, and no one supposed that any survived except those who had fled back to Rome, all were lamented as lost, both living and dead, causing the entire city to be filled with wailing. The alarm for the public interest stifled private sorrow as soon as it was announced that the enemy was at hand. Presently, with the barbarians patrolling around the walls in troops, they heard their yells and the dissonant clangor of their arms. All the interval up to the next day kept their minds in such a state of suspense that an assault seemed every moment about to be made on the city. On their first approach, when they arrived at the city, it was expected, for if this were not their design, they would have remained at the Alia. Then, towards sunset, because there was not much of the day remaining, they imagined that they would attack before night. Then the design was deferred until night, in order to strike greater terror. At length, the approach of light struck them with dismay. The calamity itself followed closely upon their continued apprehension of it, when the troops entered the gates in a hostile array. During that night, however, and the following day, the state by no means bore any resemblance to that which had fled so dastardly at the Alia. For as there was no hope that the city could be defended with so small a number of troops now remaining, it was determined that the youth fit for military service, and the abler part of the Senate with their wives and children, should retire into the citadel and capital, having collected stores of arms and corn, and from that fortified post they would defend the deities, the inhabitants, and the Roman name. The Flamen Quirinalis and the Vestal priestesses were to carry away, far from slaughter and conflagration, the objects pertaining to the state's religion, ensuring their worship would not be interrupted until no one remained to continue it. If the citadel and capital, the mansion of the gods, if the Senate, the source of public counsel, if the youth of military age, should survive the impending ruin of the city, the loss would be light of the aged, the crowd left behind in the city, and who were sure to perish under any circumstances. And in order that the plebeian portion of the multitude might bear the thing with greater resignation, the aged men, who had enjoyed triumphs and consulships, openly declared that they would die along with them, and that they would not burden the scanty stores of the armed men with those bodies, with which they were now unable to bear arms or to defend their country. Such was the consolation addressed to each other by the aged, now destined to death. Their exhortations then turned to the band of young men. They were escorted to the capital and citadel, entrusted with the remaining fortune of a city that, for 360 years, had been victorious in all its wars. As those carrying the city's hopes parted with those who chose not to survive its ruin, the scene was truly distressing. The weeping women, running undecidedly between groups, asked their husbands and children what would become of them. It was a picture of human misery. Many escorted their friends into the citadel, neither prevented nor invited. Reducing the number of non-essential persons was advantageous to the besieged, though it conflicted with human kindness. The rest of the crowd, mostly common people whom the small hill could not contain, nor sustain with such scarce provisions, poured out of the city in a continuous stream, heading for the Janiculum. Some dispersed into the countryside, others made for neighboring cities, without leadership or plan, each following their own hopes. Public hope was abandoned. Meanwhile, the Flamen Quirinalis and the Vestal virgins, setting aside their own concerns, deliberated which sacred items to carry and which to leave behind, as they lacked the strength for all. They sought the safest custody. They decided to place some in casks and bury them in the chapel adjoining the Flamen Quirinalis residence, a place now considered sacred. The rest were divided among themselves and carried by the road leading over the Sublician bridge to the Janiculum. Lucius Albinius, a Roman commoner, was conveying his wife and children in a wagon. He saw the priests and virgins on the ascent, among the crowd unfit for arms, leaving the city. Preserving the distinction between divine and human affairs, he considered it an outrage that the public priests and sacred utensils should travel on foot while his family rode. He commanded his wife and children to alight, placed the virgins and sacred utensils in the vehicle, and carried them to Caere, their intended destination. At Rome, all possible arrangements for the citadel's defense were now made. The aged returned to their homes, awaiting the enemy with minds prepared for death. Those who had held high offices, wishing to die in the insignia of their former station, adorned themselves in magnificent garments worn by those in triumphal processions. They seated themselves in their ivory chairs in the middle of their halls. Some say they dedicated themselves for their country and the citizens of Rome, with Marcus Fabius, the chief pontiff, dictating the sacred words. The Gauls, their anger from battle having subsided overnight, and having never fought a truly contested battle, were not taking the city by storm. Entering the city the next day, free from resentment, through the open Colline gate, they advanced into the Forum. They gazed upon the temples of the gods and the citadel, the only place showing signs of war. Leaving a small guard against attacks from the citadel or capital, they dispersed in quest of plunder. The streets were desolate. Some rushed into the nearest houses, others went to the most distant, believing them untouched and full of spoil. Later, terrified by the very solitude, fearing enemy stratagem while dispersed, they returned in groups to the Forum and its adjoining areas. There, the houses of the common people were shut, but the halls of the leading men lay open. They felt a greater reluctance to attack the open houses than the shut ones. They beheld, with a sort of veneration, men sitting in the porches of the palaces. Besides their ornaments and apparel, more august than human, they bore a striking resemblance to gods in the majesty of their looks and the gravity of their countenances. As they stood gazing, it is said that Marcus Papirius, one of the elders, roused the anger of a Gaul by striking him on the head with his ivory staff as the Gaul stroked his long beard. This act began the bloodshed. The rest were slain in their seats. After the slaughter of the nobles, no one was spared. The houses were plundered, and when emptied, were set on fire. Whether not all were intent on destroying the city, or it had been so determined by the Gallic leaders, some fires were set to see if the besieged could be forced to surrender out of affection for their homes. They also aimed to leave some portion of the city as a pledge to influence the enemy. Thus, the fire did not spread indiscriminately or extensively on the first day, as is usual in a captured city. From the citadel, the Romans watched their city filled with the enemy, running to and fro through the streets, a new calamity appearing in every direction. They could neither maintain their composure nor fully control their senses. Wherever the shouts of the enemy, the cries of women and children, the crackling of flames, and the crash of falling houses drew their attention, they turned their thoughts, faces, and eyes. Fortune had made them spectators of their country's fall, protectors of nothing but their own persons. They were more to be pitied than any other besieged people, for, shut out from their country, they were besieged while beholding all their possessions in the enemy's power. The night that followed such a horrifying day was no more tranquil. A restless night gave way to an equally distressing day. There was no moment free from the sight of some new disaster. Overwhelmed by so many evils, they did not waver in their determination. Though they saw everything in flames and leveled to dust, they resolved to defend the small, ill-provided hill they occupied, left as a refuge for liberty. As the same events recurred daily, as if accustomed to misfortune, they detached their thoughts from all feelings for their circumstances, regarding only their arms and the swords in their right hands as the sole remnants of their hopes. The Gauls, after several days of ineffectual war against the city's buildings, saw that amidst the fires and ruins, nothing remained but armed enemies. These Romans, neither terrified by so many disasters nor likely to surrender without force, decided to resort to extreme measures and attack the citadel. At daybreak, a signal was given, and their entire multitude arrayed in the Forum. Then, raising a shout and forming a tortoise formation, they advanced to the attack. The Romans, acting neither rashly nor precipitately, had strengthened the guards at every approach. They concentrated their main strength where they saw the battalions advancing. They allowed the enemy to ascend, judging that the higher they climbed, the more easily they would be driven back down the steep slope. They met the Gauls about midway up the ascent. Charging from the higher ground, which gave them an advantage, they routed the Gauls with great slaughter. Never again, either in small parties or with their whole force, did the Gauls attempt that kind of fighting. Abandoning all hope of succeeding by force of arms, they prepared for a blockade. Having no idea of a prolonged siege until then, they had, while burning the city, destroyed all the corn within it. During those very days, all provisions had been carried from the land to Veii. Accordingly, dividing their army, they resolved that one part should plunder the neighboring states, while the other carried on the siege of the citadel, so that the raiders of the country might supply the besiegers with corn. The Gauls who marched from the city were led by fortune itself to test Roman valor at Ardea, where Camillus was in exile. More distressed by the public's fortune than his own, he pined away, arraigning gods and men. Filled with indignation, wondering where those men were who had taken Veii and Falerii with him, who had conducted wars more by their own valor than by fortune's favor, he suddenly heard that the Gallic army was approaching. The people of Ardea, in consternation, were meeting in council on the matter. As if moved by divine inspiration, he advanced into the midst of the assembly, having until then been accustomed to absent himself from such meetings. He said, "People of Ardea, my old friends, and recently my fellow citizens, since your kindness ordained it and my good fortune achieved it, let no one suppose I have come forward here forgetful of my condition. But the present case and common danger obliges everyone to contribute whatever service he can to the common good in our alarming situation. When shall I repay you for your important services to me, if I am now remiss? Or where will you benefit from me, if not in war? By this accomplishment, I maintained my rank in my native country. Unconquered in war, I was banished during peace by my ungrateful fellow citizens. To you, men of Ardea, a favorable opportunity has been presented to return all the former favors conferred by the Roman people, such as you yourselves remember. Therefore, as being mindful of them, you are not to be upbraided with them. Also, to obtain great military renown for your city over the common enemy. The nation now approaching in disorderly march is one to which nature has given great spirits and bodies rather huge than firm. Let the disaster of Rome serve as proof. They captured the city when it lay open to them. A small handful of men from the citadel and capital withstand them. Already tired out by the slow process of a siege, they retire and spread themselves through the country. Gorged with food and wine hastily swallowed, when night comes on, they stretch themselves indiscriminately like brutes near streams of water, without entrenchment, without guards or advanced posts. They are even more incautious now than usual, in consequence of their success. If you then are disposed to defend your own walls and not to suffer all these places to become Gaul, take up arms in full force at the first watch. Follow me to slaughter, not to battle. If I do not deliver them up to you, fettered by sleep, to be butchered like cattle, I do not decline the same outcome of my affairs at Ardea as I had at Rome." Both friends and enemies agreed. No one at that time possessed equal military talent. The assembly dismissed, they refreshed themselves, carefully watching for the signal. When it came, in the quiet of early night, they met Camillus at the gates. Not far from the city, they found the Gallic camp, as foretold, unprotected and neglected on every side. They attacked with a shout. There was no fight, only slaughter. Bodies, naked and relaxed with sleep, were cut to pieces. The more remote, roused from their beds, unsure of the tumult's origin, fled, some unknowingly into the midst of the enemy. A great number, fleeing into Antium's territory, were attacked, surrounded, and cut off by the townspeople. A similar carnage befell the Tuscans in Veientian territory. They were so far from pitying the city that had been their neighbor for nearly 400 years, now overwhelmed by a strange and unheard-of enemy, that they chose that very time to raid Roman territory. Laden with plunder, they intended to lay siege to Veii, the Roman race's bulwark and last hope. Roman soldiers had seen them straggling across the country, gathered in a body, driving spoil before them. They also noticed the Tuscan camp pitched not far from Veii. At this, self-pity, then indignation, and finally resentment filled their minds. Were their calamities to be mocked by the Etrurians, from whom they had diverted the Gallic war onto themselves. They could barely curb their passions to refrain from attacking them immediately. Restrained by Quintus Caedicius, the centurion they had appointed commander, they deferred the matter until night. A leader equal to Camillus was all that was wanted. In other respects, matters were conducted with the same order and fortunate result. Furthermore, guided by prisoners who had survived the nightly slaughter, they set out for Salini against another body of Tuscans. They made still greater havoc the following night and returned to Veii, exulting in their double victory. Meanwhile in Rome, the siege was generally slow, with quiet on both sides. The Gauls were intent only on ensuring no enemy escaped their posts. Then, suddenly, a Roman youth drew the admiration of both his countrymen and the enemy. There was a sacrifice solemnized at stated times by the Fabian family on the Quirinal Hill. To perform this, Gaius Fabius Dorso descended from the Capitol, in Gabin attire, carrying sacred utensils. He passed through the midst of the enemy's posts, unmoved by their calls or threats, and reached the Quirinal Hill. After duly performing the solemn rites, he returned the same way with the same firm countenance and gait. Confident that the gods were propitious, whose worship he had not neglected even when prohibited by the fear of death, he returned to the capital to his friends. The Gauls were either astounded by such extraordinary boldness or moved by religious considerations, which that nation was by no means regardless of. In the meantime, not only the courage but also the strength of those at Veii increased daily. Not only Romans who had strayed after the unsuccessful battle or the city's capture repaired there from the country, but volunteers also flowed in from Latium to share in the spoil. It now seemed high time that their country should be recovered and rescued from the enemy's hands. But this strong body lacked a head. The very spot reminded them of Camillus, and a considerable part consisted of soldiers who had fought successfully under his guidance and auspices. Caedicius declared that he would not give occasion for any, whether god or man, to terminate his command. Rather, mindful of his own rank, he would himself call for the appointment of a general. With universal consent, it was resolved that Camillus should be sent from Ardea, but not until the Senate at Rome was first consulted. So carefully did a sense of propriety regulate every proceeding. Accordingly, dividing their army, they resolved that one part should plunder the neighboring states, while the other carried on the siege of the citadel, so that the raiders of the country might supply the besiegers with corn. The Gauls who marched from the city were led by fortune itself to test Roman valor at Ardea, where Camillus was in exile. More distressed by the public's fortune than his own, he pined away, arraigning gods and men. Filled with indignation, wondering where those men were who had taken Veii and Falerii with him, who had conducted wars more by their own valor than by fortune's favor, he suddenly heard that the Gallic army was approaching. The people of Ardea, in consternation, were meeting in council on the matter. As if moved by divine inspiration, he advanced into the midst of the assembly, having until then been accustomed to absent himself from such meetings. He said, "People of Ardea, my old friends, and recently my fellow citizens, since your kindness ordained it and my good fortune achieved it, let no one suppose I have come forward here forgetful of my condition. But the present case and common danger obliges everyone to contribute whatever service he can to the common good in our alarming situation. When shall I repay you for your important services to me, if I am now remiss? Or where will you benefit from me, if not in war? By this accomplishment, I maintain my rank in my native country. Unconquered in war, I was banished during peace by my ungrateful fellow citizens. To you, men of Ardea, a favorable opportunity has been presented to return all the former favors conferred by the Roman people, such as you yourselves remember. Therefore, as being mindful of them, you are not to be upbraided with them. Also, to obtain great military renown for your city over the common enemy. The nation now approaching in disorderly march is one to which nature has given great spirits and bodies rather huge than firm. Let the disaster of Rome serve as proof. They captured the city when it lay open to them. A small handful of men from the citadel and capital withstand them. Already tired out by the slow process of a siege, they retire and spread themselves through the country. Gorged with food and wine hastily swallowed, when night comes on, they stretch themselves indiscriminately like brutes near streams of water, without entrenchment, without guards or advanced posts. They are even more incautious now than usual, in consequence of their success. If you then are disposed to defend your own walls and not to suffer all these places to become Gaul, take up arms in full force at the first watch. Follow me to slaughter, not to battle. If I do not deliver them up to you, fettered by sleep, to be butchered like cattle, I do not decline the same outcome of my affairs at Ardea as I had at Rome." Both friends and enemies agreed. No one at that time possessed equal military talent. The assembly dismissed, they refreshed themselves, carefully watching for the signal. When it came, in the quiet of early night, they met Camillus at the gates. Not far from the city, they found the Gallic camp, as foretold, unprotected and neglected on every side. They attacked with a shout. There was no fight, only slaughter. Bodies, naked and relaxed with sleep, were cut to pieces. The more remote, roused from their beds, unsure of the tumult's origin, fled, some unknowingly into the midst of the enemy. A great number, fleeing into Antium's territory, were attacked, surrounded, and cut off by the townspeople. A similar carnage befell the Tuscans in Veientian territory. They were so far from pitying the city that had been their neighbor for nearly 400 years, now overwhelmed by a strange and unheard-of enemy, that they chose that very time to raid Roman territory. Laden with plunder, they intended to lay siege to Veii, the Roman race's bulwark and last hope. Roman soldiers had seen them straggling across the country, gathered in a body, driving spoil before them. They also noticed the Tuscan camp pitched not far from Veii. At this, self-pity, then indignation, and finally resentment filled their minds. Were their calamities to be mocked by the Etrurians, from whom they had diverted the Gallic war onto themselves? They could barely curb their passions to refrain from attacking them immediately. Restrained by Quintus Caedicius, the centurion they had appointed commander, they deferred the matter until night. A leader equal to Camillus was all that was wanted. In other respects, matters were conducted with the same order and fortunate result. Furthermore, guided by prisoners who had survived the nightly slaughter, they set out for Salini against another body of Tuscans. They made still greater havoc the following night and returned to Veii, exulting in their double victory. Meanwhile in Rome, the siege was generally slow, with quiet on both sides. The Gauls were intent only on ensuring no enemy escaped their posts. Then, suddenly, a Roman youth drew the admiration of both his countrymen and the enemy. There was a sacrifice solemnized at stated times by the Fabian family on the Quirinal Hill. To perform this, Gaius Fabius Dorso descended from the Capitol, in Gabon attire, carrying sacred utensils. He passed through the midst of the enemy's posts, unmoved by their calls or threats, and reached the Quirinal Hill. After duly performing the solemn rites, he returned the same way with the same firm countenance and gait. Confident that the gods were propitious, whose worship he had not neglected even when prohibited by the fear of death, he returned to the capital to his friends. The Gauls were either astounded by such extraordinary boldness or moved by religious considerations, which that nation was by no means regardless of. In the meantime, not only the courage but also the strength of those at Veii increased daily. Not only Romans who had strayed after the unsuccessful battle or the city's capture repaired there from the country, but volunteers also flowed in from Latium to share in the spoil. It now seemed high time that their country should be recovered and rescued from the enemy's hands. But this strong body lacked a head. The very spot reminded them of Camillus, and a considerable part consisted of soldiers who had fought successfully under his guidance and auspices. Caedicius declared that he would not give occasion for any, whether god or man, to terminate his command. Rather, mindful of his own rank, he would himself call for the appointment of a general. With universal consent, it was resolved that Camillus should be sent from Ardea, but not until the Senate at Rome was first consulted. So carefully did a sense of propriety regulate every proceeding, and so precisely did they observe distinctions in their almost desperate circumstances. They had to pass at great risk through the enemy's guards. For this purpose, a spirited youth, Pontius Camillus, offered his services. Supporting himself on cork, he was carried down the Tiber to the city. From there, where the distance from the bank was shortest, he made his way into the capital over a craggy portion of the rock, neglected by the enemy's guard. Conducted to the magistrates, he delivered the instructions received from the army. Then, having received a decree of the Senate, that Camillus should be recalled from exile at the Comitia Curiata and be forthwith appointed dictator by order of the people, and that the soldiers should have the general they wished, he passed out the same way and proceeded with his dispatches to Veii. Deputies were sent to Camillus at Ardea, conducting him to Veii. Or else, the law was passed by the Curii, and he was nominated dictator in his absence. I am more inclined to believe that he did not set out from Ardea until he found that the law was passed, because he could neither change his residence without an order of the people, nor hold the privilege of the auspices in the army until he was nominated dictator. While these things were going on at Veii, the citadel and capital of Rome were in great danger. For the Gauls, either having perceived the track of a human foot where the messenger from Veii had passed, or having themselves remarked the easy ascent by the rock at the temple of Charmides, on a moonlight night, they first sent forward an unarmed person to test the way. Delivering their arms whenever difficulty occurred, alternately supporting and drawing each other up, as the ground required, they reached the summit in such silence that they escaped the notice not only of the sentinels but also of the dogs, an animal extremely watchful of night noises. They did not escape the notice of the geese, which, being sacred to Juno, were spared despite the greatest scarcity of food. This circumstance was the cause of their preservation. For Marcus Manlius, 3 years before a consul, a man distinguished in war, aroused from sleep by their cackling and the clapping of their wings, snatched up his arms. At the same time, calling others to do the same, he proceeded to the spot. While the others were in confusion, he struck with the boss of his shield and tumbled down a Gaul who had already gained footing on the summit. When this man's fall brought down those next to him, he slew others who, in their consternation, had thrown away their arms and clung to the rocks. Now the others also assembled, beating down the enemy with javelins and stones. The entire band, having lost their footing, were hurled down the precipice in promiscuous ruin. The alarm then subsided. The remainder of the night was given up to repose, as much as their disturbed minds allowed, for the danger, though past, still kept them anxious. Day appeared, and the soldiers were summoned by trumpet to assembly to the tribunes, where recompense was to be made for both merit and demerit. Manlius was first commended for his bravery and presented with gifts, not only by the military tribunes, but with the consent of the soldiers. They all carried to his house in the citadel a contribution of 1/2 pound of corn and 1/2 pint of wine. This was a trifling matter in the telling, but the prevailing scarcity had made it a strong proof of esteem. Each man, depriving himself of his own food, contributed a portion in honor of one man, subtracted from his body and necessary requirements. Then the guards of that place where the enemy had climbed up unobserved were summoned. When Quintus Sulpicius openly declared he would punish all according to military discipline, he was deterred by the soldiers' shouts, who threw the blame on one sentinel, and he spared the rest. The man, manifestly guilty of the crime, he threw down from the rock, with the approbation of all. From this time forth, the guards on both sides became more vigilant. On the part of the Gauls, because a rumor spread that messengers passed between Veii and Rome, and on that of the Romans, from the recollection of the danger that occurred during the night. But beyond all the evils of siege and war, famine distressed both armies. Pestilence, moreover, oppressed the Gauls, being encamped in a place between hills, heated by burning houses and full of exhalations, sending up not only ashes but embers whenever the wind rose. The nation, accustomed to moisture and cold, was most intolerant of these annoyances. Suffering severely from the heat and suffocation, they were dying. Diseases spread among cattle. Becoming weary of burying themselves separately, they heaped up bodies indiscriminately and burned them, rendering the place remarkable by the name of Gallic piles. A truce was now made with the Romans, and conferences were held with the permission of the commanders. When the Gauls frequently alluded to the famine as a further motive for their surrender, to counter that opinion, bread is said to have been thrown from the capital into the enemy's advanced posts in many places. But the famine could neither be dissembled nor endured any longer. Accordingly, while the dictator was personally engaged in holding a levy, ordering his master of the horse, Lucius Valerius, to bring up troops from Veii, and making preparations and arrangements to attack the enemy on equal terms, the army of the capital, worn out with guard duty and watches, having surmounted all human sufferings, found that nature would not suffer famine alone to be overcome. Looking forward day to day for succor from the dictator, at length not only food but hope also failed. Their arms weighed down their debilitated bodies. As the guards were being relieved, they insisted that there should be either a surrender or that they should be bought off on whatever terms were possible. The Gauls intimated, in rather plain terms, that they could be induced for no very great compensation to relinquish the siege. Then the Senate was held, and instructions were given to the military tribunes to capitulate. Upon this, the matter was settled between Quintus Sulpicius, a military tribune, and Brennus, the chieftain of the Gauls. 1,000 pounds weight of gold was agreed on as the ransom of a people who were soon after to be the rulers of the world. To a transaction very humiliating in itself, insult was added. False weights were brought by the Gauls, and on the tribune objecting, his sword was thrown in addition to the weight, by the insolent Gaul. An expression intolerable to the Romans was heard. Woe to the vanquished! But both gods and men intervened, preventing the Romans from living on the condition of being ransomed. By chance, before the execrable price was fully weighed, due to the ongoing altercation, the dictator arrived. He ordered the gold removed and the Gauls to clear away. When they objected, affirming their bargain, he denied its validity. The agreement, he declared, had been made with a magistrate of inferior authority, without his orders, after he had been nominated dictator. He then notified the Gauls to prepare for battle. He ordered his men to pile their baggage, ready their arms, and recover their country with steel, not gold. Before their eyes were the temples of the gods, their wives and children, their homeland disfigured by war's calamities, and all those objects they were solemnly bound to defend, recover, and avenge. He then arrayed his army, as the half-demolished, uneven city allowed, securing every advantage for his men that military skill could provide. The Gauls, confused by the unexpected turn, seized their arms and, with rage rather than judgment, rushed upon the Romans. Fortune had changed. Now the aid of the gods and human prudence assisted the Roman cause. At the first encounter, the Gauls were routed with no greater difficulty than they had found in gaining victory at Allia. They were subsequently beaten, under the conduct of the same Camillus, in a more regular engagement, at the 8th milestone on the Gabon road, where they had retreated after their defeat. There, the slaughter was universal. Their camp was taken, and not a single person remained to carry news of the defeat. Chapter 5. Rebuilding of Rome. The dictator, having recovered his country from the enemy, returned into the city in triumph. Among the rough military jests thrown out on such occasions, he was styled, with well-deserved praises, Romulus, and parent of his country, a second founder of the city. His country, thus preserved by arms, he unquestionably saved a second time in peace. He prevented the people from moving to Veii, even with the tribunes pressing the matter earnestly after the city's burning, and the common people themselves being inclined to that measure. This was why he did not resign his dictatorship after the triumph, the Senate entreating him not to leave the Commonwealth in such an unsettled state. First of all, he proposed matters pertaining to the immortal gods, for he was a most scrupulous observer of religious duties. He secured a decree of the Senate, that all temples, as the enemy had possessed them, should be restored, their bounds traced, and expiations made for them, and that the form of expiation should be sought in the books by the Decemvirs. That a league of hospitality should be entered into by public authority with the people of Caere, because they had afforded reception to the sacred utensils of the Roman people and to their priests, and because, by the kindness of that people, the worship of the immortal gods had not been intermitted. That Capitoline games should be exhibited, for that Jupiter, supremely good and great, had protected his own mansion and the citadel of the Roman people when in danger, and that Marcus Furius, the dictator, should establish a college for that purpose, out of those who should inhabit the Capitol and citadel. Mention was also introduced of expiating the voice heard by night, which had announced the calamity before the Gallic War and was neglected. A temple was ordered in the new street to Ius Locutus. The gold rescued from the Gauls, and also that which, during the alarm, had been collected from other temples into the recess of Jupiter's temple, its original temples confused, was all judged sacred and ordered to be placed under Jupiter's throne. Already, the religious scruples of the state had appeared in this. When gold was wanting for public uses to make up the agreed ransom for the Gauls, they had accepted that contributed by the matrons, so as not to touch the sacred gold. Thanks were returned to the matrons, and to this was added the honor of having funeral orations pronounced on them after death, in the same manner as the men. These things pertaining to the gods and such measures as could be transacted through the Senate being finished. Then, at length, as the tribunes were teasing the common people by their unceasing harangues, to leave the ruins and remove to Veii, a city ready prepared for them, Camillus, escorted by the entire Senate, ascended the tribunal and spoke as follows. Romans, contentions with the tribunes of the people are so disagreeable to me that in my most melancholy exile, while I resided at Ardea, I had no other consolation than being removed from these contests. For this same reason, I would never have returned, even though you recalled me by a decree of the Senate and by order of the people. Nor has it been any change in my own sentiments, but in your fortune, that has persuaded me to return now. For the question was that my country should remain in its established seat, not that I should reside in my country. On the present occasion, I would gladly remain quiet and silent, were not this struggle also pertaining to my country's interests, to be wanting to which, as long as life lasts, were based in others, in Camillus impious. For why have we recovered it? Why have we rescued it when besieged from the hands of the enemy, if we ourselves desert it when recovered? And when the Gauls were victorious, the entire city captured, both the gods and the natives of Rome still retained and inhabited the Capitol and citadel, shall even the citadel and the Capitol be deserted, now that the Romans are victorious and the city has been recovered? And shall our prosperous fortune cause more desolation to this city than our adverse caused? Truly, if we had no religious institutions established with the city and regularly transmitted down to us, still the divine power has so manifestly interested itself on behalf of the Roman state on this trying occasion, that I should think all neglect of divine worship was removed from the minds of men. Consider the events of these latter years, one after the other, whether prosperous or adverse. You will find that all things succeeded favorably with us while we followed the gods, and unfavorably when we neglected them. Now, first of all, the Veientian War, of how many years' duration, with what immense labor waged, was not brought to a termination until the water was discharged from the Alban lake by the admonition of the gods. What, in the name of heaven, regarding this recent calamity of our city? Did it arise until the voice sent from heaven concerning the approach of the Gauls was treated lightly? Until the law of nations was violated by our ambassadors, and until such violation was passed over by us with the same indifference towards the gods, when should it have been punished by us? Accordingly, vanquished, made captives, and ransomed, we have suffered such punishments at the hands of gods and men that we are now a warning to the whole world. Afterwards, our misfortunes reminded us of our religious duties. We fled for refuge to the gods, to the seat of Jupiter, supremely good and great. Amidst the ruin of all our effects, we partly concealed our sacred utensils in the earth. Part of them we carried away to the neighboring cities and removed from the eyes of the enemy. Though deserted by gods and men, still we did not interrupt the worship of the gods. Accordingly, they have restored to us our country and victory, our ancient renown in war which had been lost, and on our enemies who, blinded by avarice, have violated the faith of a treaty with respect to the weight of gold, they have turned dismay and flight and slaughter. When you behold such striking instances of the effects of honoring or neglecting the deity, do you perceive what an act of impiety we are about to perpetrate, scarcely emerging from the wreck of our former misconduct and calamity? We possess a city founded under auspices and auguries. Not a spot is there in it that is not full of religious rites and of the gods. The days for the anniversary sacrifices are not more definitely stated than are the places in which they are to be performed. All these gods, both public and private, do you Romans pretend to forsake? What similarity does your conduct bear to that which, lately during the siege, was beheld with no less admiration by the enemy than by yourselves in that excellent Gaius Fabius, when he descended from the citadel amidst the Gallic weapons and performed on the Quirinal hill the solemn rites of the Fabian family? Is it your wish that family religious rites should not be intermitted even during war, but that the public rites and the Roman gods should be deserted even in time of peace? And that the pontiffs and flame men should be more negligent of public religious ceremonies than a private individual in the anniversary rite of a particular family? Perhaps someone may say that we will either perform these duties at Veii, or that we will send our priests from there in order to perform them, neither of which can be done without infringing on the established forms. For not to enumerate all the sacred rites severally and all the gods, can the lectisternium in the banquet of Jupiter be performed in any other place save in the capital? What shall I say of the eternal fire of Vesta, and of the statue, which, as the pledge of empire, is kept under the safeguard of her temple? What, O Mars Gradivus, and you, Father Quirinus of your Ancilia, is it right that these sacred things, coeval with the city, some of them more ancient than the city's origin, should be abandoned to profanation? And observe the difference existing between us and our ancestors. They handed down to us certain sacred rites to be performed by us on the Alban and on the Lavinian mounts. Was it in conformity with religion that these sacred rites were transferred to us to Rome from the cities of our enemies? Shall we transfer them hence to Veii, an enemy's city, without impiety? Come, recollect how often sacred rites are performed anew, because some ceremony of our country had been omitted through negligence or accident. On a late occasion, what circumstance, after the prodigy of the Alban lake, proved a remedy to the state distressed by the Veientian war, but the repetition of the sacred rites and the renewal of the auspices? But further, as if duly mindful of ancient religious usages, we have both transferred foreign deities to Rome and have established new ones. Very recently, imperial Juno was transferred from Veii and had her dedication performed on a day distinguished for the extraordinary zeal of the matrons, and with what a full attendance. We have directed a temple to be erected to Ius Locutus, in consequence of the heavenly voice heard in the new street. To our other solemnities we have added the Capitoline Games, and by direction of the Senate we have founded a new college for that purpose. Which of these things need to be done if we were to leave the Roman city together with the Gauls? If it was not voluntarily we remained in the capital for so many months of siege? If we were retained by the enemy through motives of fear? We are speaking of the sacred rites and of the temples. What, pray, of the priests? Does it not occur to you what a degree of profaneness would be committed in respect of them? The Vestals, forsooth, have but that one settlement, from which nothing ever disturbed them, except the capture of the city. It is an act of impiety for the Flamen Dielis to remain for a single night without the city. Do you mean to make them Veientian instead of Roman priests? And shall the virgins forsake you, O Vesta? And shall the Flamen, by living abroad, draw on himself and on his country such a weight of guilt every night? What of the other things, all of which we transact under auspices within the pomerium? To what oblivion, to what neglect do we consign them? The assemblies of the curias, which comprise military affairs, the assemblies of the centuries, at which you elect consuls and military tribunes, when can they be held under auspices, unless where they are wont to be held? Shall we transfer them to Veii? Or whether for the purpose of holding their elections shall the people assemble at such great inconvenience into a city deserted by gods and men? But the situation itself forces us to leave a city desolated by fire and ruin, and move to Veii, where all things are intact. We must not distress the needy common people by rebuilding here. I believe this is merely a pretext, not the real motive, even if I said nothing on the subject. You remember that before the Gauls arrived, when public and private buildings were still unharmed, and the city stood safely, this same question was debated, that we should move to Veii. Observe then, tribunes, what a difference there is between my way of thinking and yours. You think that though it may not have been advisable then, it certainly ought to be done now. I, on the contrary, and do not be surprised until you have heard the full case, admitting it was advisable to remove when the entire city was safe, would not vote for relinquishing these ruins now. For then, victory would have been the cause of our removal into a captured city, one that would be glorious to ourselves and our posterity. While now this same removal would be wretched and disgraceful to us, and glorious to the Gauls. For we shall appear not to have left our country as conquerors, but to have lost it from having been vanquished. The flight at Alia, the capture of the city, the blockading of the capital, will seem to have imposed on us the necessity of forsaking our household gods, of resorting to exile and flight from a place we were unable to defend. Have the Gauls been able to demolish Rome, which the Romans shall be deemed unable to restore? What remains but that if they should now come with new forces, for it is evident that their number is scarcely credible, and should they feel disposed to dwell in this city, captured by them and deserted by you, would you suffer? What, if not the Gauls, but your old enemies, the Equins and Volscians, should form the design of moving to Rome? Would you be willing that they should become Romans, while you become Vaencians? Would you prefer this to be a desert in your possession, or a city of the enemy? For my part, I can see nothing more impious. Is it because you are averse to building that you are prepared to incur this guilt, this disgrace? Even though no better, no more ample structure could be erected throughout the entire city than that cottage of our founder, is it not better to dwell in cottages like shepherds and rustics, amidst your sacred places and your household gods, than to go publicly into exile? Our forefathers, strangers and shepherds, when there was nothing in these places but woods and marshes, erected a new city in a very short time. Do we, with a capital and citadel safe, and the temples of the gods still standing, feel it irksome to build up what has been burned? And what we individually would have done if our private residence had been burned down, shall we as a body refuse to do in the case of a public conflagration? What if, by some evil design or accident, a fire should break out at Veii, and the flames, spread by the wind, as may happen, should consume a considerable portion of the city? Are we then to seek Fidene or Gabii, or any other city to move to? Has our native soil so slight a hold on us, or this earth which we call mother? Or does our love of country lie merely in the surface and in the timber of the houses? For my part, I will acknowledge to you, while I was absent, though I am less disposed to remember this as the effect of your injustice than of my own misfortune, as often as my country came into my mind, all these circumstances occurred to me. The hills, the plains, the Tiber, the face of the country familiar to my eyes, and this sky beneath which I had been born and educated. May these now induce you, by their endearing hold on you, to remain in your present settlement, rather than they should cause you to pine away through regret after having left them. Not without good reason did gods and men select this place for founding a city, these most healthful hills, a commodious river, by means of which the produce of the soil may be conveyed from the inland countries, by which maritime supplies may be obtained. It is close enough to the sea for all purposes of convenience, yet not exposed by too much proximity to the dangers of foreign fleets. It is a situation in the center of the regions of Italy, singularly adapted by nature for the increase of a city. The very size of such a new city is proof. Romans, the present year is the 365th year of the city. For so long a time are you waging war amidst nations of such long standing, yet not to mention single cities, neither the Volscians combined with the Equins, so many and such strong towns, nor all Etruria, so potent by land and sea, occupying the breadth of Italy between the two seas, can cope with you in war. And as the case is so where, in the name of goodness, is the wisdom in you who have tried this situation, to make trial now of some other? When though your own valor may be removed elsewhere, the fortune of this place certainly cannot be transferred. Here is the capital, where, a human head being found, it was foretold that in that place would be the head of the world and the chief seat of the empire. Here, when the capital was to be freed by the rites of augury, Juventus and Terminus, to the very great joy of our fathers, suffered not themselves to be moved. Here is the fire of Vesta, here the Ancilia sent down from heaven, here are all the gods propitious to you if you stay. Camillus is said to have moved them with other parts of his speech, but chiefly by those which related to religious matters. But an expression, seasonably uttered, determined the matter while still undecided. A meeting of the Senate was being held in the Curia Hostilia regarding these questions, when some troops returning from relieving guard passed through the forum. A centurion in the comitium cried out, "Standard-bearer, fix your standard. It is best for us to remain here." Upon hearing this expression, both the Senate came out from the Senate house, and all cried out that they embraced the omen. The common people, who were collected around, joined their approbation. The law under discussion being rejected, the building of the city commenced in several parts at once. Tiles were supplied at public expense. The privilege of hewing stone and felling timber, wherever each person wished, was granted, security being taken that they would finish the buildings that year. Their haste took away all attention to regulating the course of the streets. Setting aside all distinction of property, they built on any part that was vacant. That is the reason why the ancient sewers, at first conducted through the public streets, now in many places pass under private houses, and why the form of the city appears more like one taken up by individuals than regularly portioned out by commissioners.